My name is Valerie. I am 33 years old, and until last Thanksgiving, I let my family treat me like a charity case in my own home. We were sitting around a massive mahogany dining table when my father pointed his wineglass right at my face. "You and your kid are just freeloaders taking advantage of your successful brother," he yelled. My mother smirked in complete agreement, while my brother chuckled softly. They had no idea they were sitting inside a multi-million-dollar estate that belonged entirely to me. Without hesitation, I calmly wiped my 7-year-old son's mouth, looked my father dead in the eye, and told him he had exactly 12 hours to leave. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to set a hard boundary with toxic relatives who took your kindness for weakness. Growing up in a status-obsessed suburb outside of Chicago Image was the only currency my parents truly valued. Now sitting in the grand formal dining room of a sprawling estate, that lifelong obsession was on full display. Outside, the November air was bitter and cold, with a harsh wind whipping through the barren trees. But inside the dining room was a masterpiece of modern luxury, artificially warm and visually stunning. Huge floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a meticulously manicured lawn and a private lake that shimmered under the moonlight. A heavy, intricate crystal chandelier hung above us, casting a warm golden glow over the imported linen tablecloths and the extravagant Thanksgiving feast my mother had insisted on catering. The table was practically groaning under the weight of polished silver platters, filled with roasted turkey truffle, mashed potatoes, roasted vegetables, and expensive bottles of imported wine. It looked exactly like a photograph from a high-end lifestyle magazine, perfectly curated, incredibly expensive, and entirely soulless. I sat quietly near the far end of the long table, purposefully positioning myself away from the center of attention. Beside me was my 7-year-old son, Leo. He was happily eating his dinner, his small hands carefully holding his fork, completely unaware of the heavy, suffocating tension that always accompanied our family gatherings. Across from me sat my older brother, Cameron. At 36 years old, Cameron was the undisputed golden child of the family. He wore a custom-tailored suit even to a family holiday dinner, his posture oozing a level of unearned arrogance that set my teeth on edge. At the head of the table sat my father, Richard, a man who measured human worth strictly by bank account balances, zip codes, and corporate titles. My mother, Catherine, sat immediately to his right, her posture rigid and her sharp eyes constantly scanning the room to ensure everything met her exacting, impossible standards. For the first hour of the holiday dinner, I focused entirely on Leo, keeping my head down and my responses to their questions brief and non-committal. I had learned long ago that invisibility was the safest and most effective strategy when dealing with my parents. The conversation, as always, revolved entirely around Cameron and his supposed achievements. My father was holding court, loudly praising Cameron for his brilliance as a wealth manager. Richard raised his glass of dark red wine, offering a grandiose toast to his son. "We are just so incredibly proud of you, Cameron," my father declared, his voice booming across the spacious room. "Providing this magnificent home for us, taking care of your parents in their golden years. It shows true character and exceptional success." Cameron accepted the lavish praise with a modest nod that I knew was entirely fake. He swirled the wine in his glass, leaning back in his upholstered chair with the casual confidence of a king surveying his castle. "It is my absolute pleasure, Dad," Cameron replied smoothly, a practiced smile on his face. "You and Mom deserve the absolute best. And I am happy to share my hard-earned success with the family." My mother placed a perfectly manicured hand over her heart, her diamond rings catching the light from the chandelier overhead. "You have always been so generous and thoughtful, Cameron," she cooed, her voice thick with exaggerated maternal pride. "Not everyone would be so willing to take on such heavy financial responsibilities, especially when others in this room contribute absolutely nothing to our well-being." I felt the familiar, sharp sting of her passive-aggressive insult, but I kept my face completely blank. I reached over and gently cut another piece of turkey for Leo, pretending I had not heard her cruel remark. This was their favorite game to play. They loved to use Cameron's fabricated success as a blunt weapon to remind me of my supposed failures. In their eyes, I was just the struggling, pathetic single mother who had ruined her life at 26. I was the cautionary tale they whispered about, to their country club friends, the burden they graciously allowed to exist in their shadow. The tension in the room grew thicker and more unbearable as the dinner progressed. My parents became increasingly emboldened by the wine they were drinking, their subtle digs transforming into direct, unavoidable insults. Leo, sensing the negative change in atmosphere, shifted nervously in his chair and accidentally knocked his elbow against his juice glass. The glass tipped over, spilling a small puddle of apple juice onto the pristine white tablecloth. It was a minor accident, the kind of harmless thing a 7-year-old boy does every single day. But in this house, under the watchful, critical eyes of my parents, it was a spark hitting a powder keg. "Watch what you are doing!" My father snapped immediately, his voice sharp, loud, and aggressive. "This is an incredibly expensive dining set." I immediately grabbed my cloth napkin to soak up the spill, moving quickly to shield my son from his grandfather's anger. "It is fine, Dad," I said calmly, dabbing at the wet spot. "I have got it. It was just a small accident." Richard slammed his heavy hand down on the solid mahogany table. The silverware rattled loudly against the fine china, and Leo physically jumped in his seat, his small eyes widening with genuine fear. "No, it is not fine," my father shouted, his face reddening as he glared directly at me. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You have absolutely no respect for nice things because you have never had to work hard to earn them." The sudden violent outburst echoed loudly in the large dining room. I stopped wiping the table and looked at him, feeling a cold, hard knot form in the pit of my stomach. My mother leaned back in her chair, lifting her wine glass to her lips with a deeply satisfied smirk. She was thoroughly enjoying the show, happy to see me being put in my place. "You and your kid are just freeloaders," my father yelled, pointing his half-empty wine glass directly in my face. The dark red liquid sloshed dangerously close to the crystal rim. "You sit here eating the expensive food Cameron paid for, living on the luxury property Cameron leased for us, taking advantage of your successful brother's endless charity. You contribute nothing to this family, Valerie, absolutely nothing. You should be down on your knees thanking him for letting you crash in the guest house." I looked over at Cameron. He did not defend me. He did not ask our father to lower his voice or point out that a young child was getting scared by the yelling. Instead, Cameron just sat there and chuckled softly, a smug, self-satisfied sound that grated horribly against my ears. He took another slow sip of his expensive wine, clearly relishing the moment of my total humiliation. The silence that followed my father's screaming felt heavy, toxic, and suffocating. Any normal person might have cried or yelled back or stormed out of the dining room in a flood of tears. 5 years ago, when I was younger and more vulnerable, I might have done exactly that. I might have apologized for taking up space. But I was no longer the frightened, insecure girl they thought I was. I felt my heart steady in my chest, recognizing that this was the definitive end of my tolerance. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I turned my attention entirely to my son, picked up a clean cloth napkin, and gently wiped a stray crumb from his cheek. I offered him a soft, reassuring smile, letting him know without words that he was completely safe and that none of this was his fault. Then I slowly pushed my heavy wooden chair back and stood up. The scraping of the chair legs against the hardwood floor sounded remarkably loud in the dead quiet room. I looked down the length of the long table, making deliberate, unwavering eye contact with my mother, then my brother, and finally my father. I let the silence stretch for several long seconds, ensuring I had their complete and undivided attention before I spoke. My voice, when I finally broke the silence, was quiet, perfectly steady, and completely devoid of any emotion. "You have exactly 12 hours to leave," I said. For a split second, nobody at the table moved or breathed. Then my father let out a loud, booming laugh that bounced off the walls. My mother joined in, her high-pitched, mocking giggles filling the elegant space. Cameron shook his head, looking at me as if I had completely lost my grip on reality. They thought it was the funniest, most pathetic thing they had ever heard. The empty, desperate threat of a delusional single mother who had forgotten her lowly place in the family hierarchy. They had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath their feet was about to crumble. The sound of their laughter bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of the dining room, sharp and grating against my ears. My father wiped a tear of mirth from his eye, shaking his head as he reached for his wineglass. My mother let out a dramatic sigh, fanning herself with her linen napkin, as if my simple statement had been the punchline to a brilliant joke. I did not react. I did not defend myself. I simply reached across the table and picked up my son's porcelain plate. I scraped the remaining turkey and mashed potatoes onto my own plate with slow, deliberate movements. My hands were perfectly steady. Leo looked up at me with his big brown eyes, sensing the hostility in the room, but trusting my calm demeanor. I gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze, a silent promise that we were leaving this toxic environment right now. But my mother was not finished. The amusement on her face quickly hardened back into her default expression of bitter disappointment. She adjusted her posture, sitting up perfectly straight in her high-backed chair, and decided this was the perfect moment to remind everyone why I was the ultimate failure. "You have always had this incredibly inflated sense of your own importance, Valerie," my mother said, her voice dripping with condescension. "It is honestly pathetic. You stand there making ridiculous threats in a house you could not afford to step foot in if it were not for your brother. You really think you have the right to make demands after everything you have put this family through?" I kept my eyes focused on stacking our silverware, refusing to give her the reaction she so desperately craved. My silence only seemed to fuel her anger. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany table, and began to recount my history like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "You ruined your life at 26, she stated loudly, making sure every word carried across the large room. "You had a bright future ahead of you. You were at a respectable university. You could have pursued a real career, found a wealthy husband, and settled down into a proper life. Instead, you got pregnant. You dropped out of a perfectly good college program to play single mother, bringing shame and embarrassment to this entire family." I carefully picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. The history she was rewriting was so far from the truth, it was almost comical, but I knew better than to argue. When I had my son, I did not ruin my life. I simply shifted my priorities. I left my traditional university program because I had discovered a passion for software development and coding that did not require sitting in a lecture hall. But to my parents, leaving a prestigious school to write code on a cheap laptop in a cramped one-bedroom apartment was the ultimate disgrace. They had cut me off financially and emotionally the moment I told them I was keeping my baby and pursuing my own path. "And look what your choices got you," my mother continued, gesturing dismissively toward my simple, modest clothing. "You spend your days playing with computers, claiming to be running some sort of business while you scrape by. You are 33 years old, Valerie. You have no husband, no real career, and no social standing whatsoever. If it were not for the absolute grace and endless generosity of your brother, you and that child would probably be living in a shelter." She turned her gaze toward Cameron, and her entire face softened into an expression of absolute adoration. The contrast between how she looked at him and how she looked at me was a physical blow, even after all these years. She reached out and patted Cameron's hand, her voice taking on a sweet, reverent tone. "Thank goodness we have Cameron," she cooed, gazing around the magnificent dining room as if she were in a museum. "Look at what he provides for us. He works unbelievable hours at his wealth management firm, dealing with high-net-worth clients just to make sure his parents are comfortable in their golden years. Do you have any idea what the monthly lease is on a $4 million estate like this? The sheer magnitude of his financial responsibility is staggering." Cameron puffed out his chest, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive tailored suit. He looked at our mother with a look of fake humility that made my stomach turn. "I am just doing my duty as a son, Mom," he said smoothly. "Family takes care of family. That is what separates successful people from the rest of the world. We know how to provide." He turned his attention back to me, and the fake humility vanished, replaced instantly by cold, hard arrogance. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest as he looked me up and down with utter disdain. "Mom is right, Valerie," Cameron said, his voice lowering into a threatening, pompous register. "You need a serious reality check. You come into this main house, eat the food I pay for, and disrespect our father. You seem to forget exactly who keeps a roof over your head. I am the one who secured the lease on this entire property. I am the one who convinced the corporate landlord to let you crash in the guest house out back because I took pity on you and your situation. I gripped the edge of the dining table. The sheer audacity of his lie was breathtaking. My heart pounded against my ribs, and a fierce, burning desire to scream the truth rose in my throat. I wanted to slam my hands on the table and tell my parents that their golden boy was completely broke. I wanted to shout that Cameron had not paid a single dime in rent for 14 months. I wanted to rip away his smug facade and reveal that I was the faceless corporate landlord he was bragging about. The words were right there resting on the tip of my tongue, ready to destroy his entire world, but I bit my tongue. I pressed my lips tightly together and swallowed the truth down. Exposing him right now in the middle of a heated argument would just result in a chaotic screaming match. They would deny it. They would demand proof. They would accuse me of making up desperate lies to save face. I needed this execution to be flawless, legal, and absolutely undeniable. I needed them to feel the full weight of their arrogance crashing down on them all at once. My silence right now was my ultimate leverage. Letting them continue to believe they held all the power would only make their inevitable fall that much more devastating. I understand exactly what you are saying, Cameron, I replied, my voice dangerously calm and devoid of any inflection. See that you remember it, he snapped back, pointing a finger at me. You should be down on your knees showing some gratitude. Instead, you are throwing a temper tantrum. I allow you to stay on this property, Valerie. Do not push me, or I will make one phone call to the property management company and have you and your kid thrown out on the street by morning. Try finding an apartment with your pathetic income. I did not flinch at his threat. I just stared at him, locking away every cruel word, every smug look, every ounce of their misplaced superiority. I reached down and took Leo's small, warm hand in mine. Come on, sweetie, I said softly to my son. We are going home now. I turned my back on my family. I did not look at my father's red, angry face. I did not look at my mother's triumphant smirk. I did not look at my brother's arrogant posture. I walked slowly and deliberately across the expensive hardwood floor, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the grand hallway of the main house. I opened the heavy oak front door and stepped out into the freezing November night. The bitter wind whipped my hair around my face as I walked down the long, sweeping driveway toward the smaller, beautifully renovated guest house tucked away near the edge of the woods. The cold air felt cleansing against my skin. Behind me, I could hear the faint sound of my family's laughter, resuming completely oblivious to the reality of their situation. They thought they had won. They thought they had put the pathetic, freeloading single mother back in her place. I squeezed Leo's hand gently as we walked up the steps to our front door. I unlocked it and let the warmth of our home wash over us. I was not a freeloader. I was not a failure. I was the architect of my own life, and the clock on their luxurious stolen fantasy had just started ticking. Once inside the guest house, the heavy atmosphere of the main estate immediately melted away. This space was mine, designed and decorated with the warmth and security that I had always wanted to provide for my son. I gently helped Leo off with his heavy winter coat, hanging it neatly on the small wooden rack by the door. He was very quiet, his young mind clearly trying to process the loud and angry voices he had just witnessed across the lawn. I knelt down to his eye level, smoothing his dark hair back from his forehead. I told him he did a great job at dinner and that his grandfather was just having a grumpy night. I kept my voice light and reassuring, making sure he knew that the anger in that other house had absolutely nothing to do with him. He nodded, wrapping his small arms around my neck for a quick hug before running off to his bedroom to put on his pajamas. I did not shed a single tear as I watched him go down the hall. Years ago, a night like this would have sent me spiraling into a deep depression, crying on the bathroom floor and questioning my own self-worth. I used to let their harsh words dictate my reality. But tonight, there was no sorrow left in my heart. There was only cold, calculating clarity. I went into Leo's room, tucked him securely into his bed, and read him a story about a brave knight exploring a mechanical forest. I stayed by his side, keeping my breathing steady and calm until his chest rose and fell in a deep, peaceful rhythm. Once I was certain he was completely asleep and feeling safe, I gently closed his bedroom door and walked down the short hallway to my home office. My office was a sharp contrast to the lavish over-the-top decor of the main house. It was minimalist, highly functional, and equipped with top-tier technology. A massive curved monitor sat on a sleek standing desk flanked by external hard drives and a heavy-duty mechanical keyboard. This room was the silent command center where I had built my life from the ground up. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and took a deep, steadying breath. I pressed the power button on my laptop, watching the screen flicker to life. As the operating system booted up, my mind briefly flashed back to the endless nights I had spent typing lines of code at a tiny kitchen table in a terrible apartment, holding a sleeping infant with one arm while I worked. My parents thought I had ruined my life because I did not fit their narrow country club definition of success. They believed a college dropout could only ever be a pathetic failure. They had absolutely no idea that the logistics software patch I developed had revolutionized supply chain management for 3 major global retailers. They did not know that 2 years ago, a massive tech conglomerate had bought my proprietary software for an 8-figure sum, paying me entirely in cash. I opened a secure browser window and navigated to a private administrative portal. I typed in my complex master password and tapped the physical security key plugged into the side of my laptop. A 2-factor authentication code popped up on my phone, and I entered the 6 digits with rapid, precise keystrokes. The screen loaded, revealing a clean, dark-themed dashboard with a gold logo in the top left corner. The text read, Apex Holdings, LLC, in bold, elegant lettering. I navigated to the Property Management tab and clicked on the file labeled Residential Assets. There it was, the sprawling $4 million estate my family was currently treating as their personal kingdom. The property deed was scanned and attached to the digital file listing Apex Holdings, LLC as the sole and absolute owner. And I was the sole proprietor and CEO of Apex Holdings. I bought this entire property outright, completely debt-free, a little over 2 years ago. It was supposed to be a quiet investment, a safe place for me and Leo to live in the guest house, while the main house appreciated in value over time. I clicked on the tenant ledger linked to the main house. Cameron's name sat at the very top of the commercial lease agreement. The numbers on the screen were glaring and undeniable. The ledger showed a massive column of red zeros extending down the page. Cameron had signed a legally binding, heavily discounted rental agreement with my holding company, begging me to let him play the role of the wealthy provider for our parents. I had agreed, demanding absolute anonymity in return, wanting my parents to enjoy a comfortable retirement without my wealth becoming a daily point of toxic contention. But Cameron had not paid a single cent of his heavily discounted rent in exactly 14 months. I scrolled down to the legal provisions section of the lease document. Because he was so eager to show off and so desperate to secure the house to bolster his fake image, Cameron had blindly signed a strict breach of contract clause. It stated clearly that if the tenant fell more than 90 days behind on payments and exhibited hostile behavior toward the property owner or its representatives, the landlord had the absolute right to terminate the lease with a 12-hour emergency eviction notice. He had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his fake empire. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I opened a new document template linked directly to the property management software. I began filling in the official fields for a notice of immediate lease termination. I typed in Cameron's full legal name, the address of the main house, and listed the exact amount of back rent he owed to Apex Holdings, LLC. I cited the specific clause regarding hostile behavior toward the property owner, vividly recalling the feeling of my father pointing a wine glass in my face while Cameron laughed. Every keystroke felt like a heavy chain snapping off my shoulders. I was no longer the helpless victim of their endless emotional abuse. I reviewed the digital document one last time, ensuring every legal requirement was perfectly met. The wording was cold, formal, and entirely unforgiving. I attached the secure digital signature of the LLC manager, binding the action legally. Then I took a final breath and moved my cursor over to the automated dispatch system. This highly efficient system would instantly alert my retained property management firm and automatically generate the physical documents required for immediate law enforcement support. I slowly looked at the glowing digital clock in the top corner of my screen. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. 12 hours from now would be 8 o'clock in the morning, giving my security team enough time to assemble and arrive right as my parents were hosting their pretentious post-holiday brunch. I clicked the final button to execute the protocol. A green confirmation banner flashed across the top of my monitor. The 12-hour countdown timer on the eviction protocol was officially initiated. The digital clock began ticking down the seconds, a silent, unstoppable force that was about to wipe away their entire delusion. I closed the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and listened to the wind howling outside the guest house window, waiting for the storm to hit. The sound of the wind rattling the heavy oak branches against the roof tiles brought a deep sense of comfort. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the small kitchenette to brew a cup of herbal tea. As the kettle began to hum, I took a moment to truly look around the space I had created for myself and Leo. The guest house was not massive, but it was immaculate and entirely ours. I had designed every square inch of it after the purchase, choosing warm cherry wood floors, soft neutral tones, and durable furniture that a 7-year-old could actually live on without fear of ruining it. It was the exact opposite of the main house, with its fragile crystal and untouchable surfaces. This was a home built on genuine stability, not a hollow stage set designed to impress wealthy neighbors. I poured the hot water into my favorite ceramic mug and breathed in the soothing scent of chamomile. For the first time all day, the knot of tension in my shoulders began to dissolve. I carried my mug back to the office and bypassed my laptop, entirely turning my attention to the heavy steel wall safe bolted securely behind a framed print of the Chicago skyline. I spun the combination dial, inputting the sequence with practiced ease, and pulled the heavy metal door open. Inside rested a thick leather-bound physical ledger. While the digital portal managed the automated alerts and legal notices, I kept this physical book as a tangible record of my journey. It grounded me. I pulled the heavy book from the safe, set it gently on my desk, and flipped it open to the center pages. The crisp white paper was filled with neat handwritten columns of numbers, a stark visual representation of everything I had achieved and everything my family had chosen to ignore. My finger traced the very first entry on the page, dated nearly 7 years ago, a meager deposit of $400. That was the seed money for what eventually became Apex Logistics. When my parents threw me out for choosing to keep Leo and walking away from their approved career path, I had nothing but a cheap laptop and a fierce determination to survive. I spent my days working as a data entry clerk and my nights teaching myself advanced cloud architecture. I noticed glaring inefficiencies in how local shipping companies tracked their freight. While my parents were busy telling their country club friends that I was a lost cause, I was writing thousands of lines of code at a wobbly thrift store table. I built a lightweight cloud-based logistics patch that streamlined warehouse routing. Within 5 years, my little software patch had evolved into an enterprise-level platform used by global shipping conglomerates. The numbers in the ledger grew exponentially as I turned the pages, reflecting the rapid scaling of my business. Then came the entry from exactly 26 months ago, a massive 9-figure deposit. A major tech giant had acquired my software platform in a complete buyout, paying entirely in cash. I had secured my future and Leo's future before I even turned 32. I could have bought a penthouse in Manhattan or a beachfront mansion in Malibu. Instead, I wanted to put down roots in a quiet, safe community with excellent schools for my son. I found this $4 million estate sitting quietly on the market and purchased it through Apex Holdings, LLC, to maintain my absolute privacy. I paid in full in cash with zero financing. I did not want a mortgage. I did not want debt. I just wanted peace. But peace was a rare commodity when dealing with my family. I turned to the final section of the ledger, a separate tab I had created specifically for the main house lease agreement. I took a slow sip of my tea, letting the warm liquid soothe my throat as I stared at the grim reality of my brother's financial life. Cameron was the golden child, the brilliant wealth manager who supposedly held the keys to the financial universe. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on, praising his expensive suits, his luxury sports cars, and his grand tales of stock market victories. They believed he was a titan of industry who graciously provided for them out of the goodness of his heart. The ledger told a very different, deeply pathetic story. The first 3 months of the lease were the only entries recorded in black ink. Cameron had actually paid the heavily discounted rent for exactly 90 days. It was a fraction of what the property would fetch on the open market, a sweetheart deal I had agreed to solely because I wanted my parents to enjoy a beautiful home in their retirement. I had given him the gift of playing the hero, charging him a mere pittance just to make the legal contract valid. But even that tiny amount proved to be too much for the great wealth manager to handle. After the 3rd month, the ink on the ledger turned completely red. Month 4 was a missed payment. Month 5 brought a frantic text message from Cameron claiming a temporary cash flow issue due to a big client restructuring their portfolio. Month 6 was radio silence. By month 8, I had to formally request payment through the LLC's anonymous property manager. Cameron had responded with extreme hostility, threatening the property manager and claiming he was good for the money. The red ink marched relentlessly down the page. 10 months, 12 months. Now, we were sitting at exactly 14 months of total delinquency. He owed Apex Holdings tens of thousands of dollars in back rent, late fees, and penalties. The truth was that Cameron was a master of illusion. He drove a leased car he could barely afford. He wore suits bought on high-interest credit cards. He spent every dime he earned trying to project an image of extreme wealth to impress his colleagues and our parents. When he discovered I had purchased the estate through a corporate entity, he saw the perfect opportunity to cement his status as the ultimate provider without actually doing the work. He thought he could manipulate the faceless corporate landlord the same way he manipulated our parents. He had no idea he was trying to scam his own sister, the very person he spent his entire life looking down upon. I ran my hand over the red numbers, feeling a profound sense of disgust. It was not about the money. I did not need his rent checks to survive. I had more than enough wealth to sustain my family for generations. It was about the sheer, unadulterated disrespect. Cameron was living in a mansion I owned, eating food prepared in a kitchen I paid for, and entertaining our parents in a dining room that belonged legally to me. Yet he had the absolute audacity to stand there tonight in my house and tell me I was a freeloader. He had pointed his finger at my face and threatened to throw me out onto the street. He had smiled while our father screamed at me, completely content to let me absorb the abuse while he played the benevolent savior. The memory of how he acquired that savior status burned vividly in my mind, a sharp contrast to the arrogant man sitting at the dining table tonight. It happened exactly 2 years ago, right after the acquisition of my software company went public in private financial circles. I lived in my modest 2-bedroom apartment, making arrangements to purchase the estate through Apex Holdings. I wanted to move our parents into the main house and take the guest house for myself, envisioning a peaceful arrangement where they could enjoy retirement without knowing my wealth. If my father found out I was a multimillionaire, his demands would be endless, and his resentment over my unconventional success would make our relationship more toxic. Anonymity was my shield. Then came the evening. Cameron showed up at my apartment door unannounced. I opened the door to find the golden child completely unraveling. His perfect hair was disheveled, his designer tie hung loosely, and his face was pale with terror. He pushed his way inside before I could ask what was wrong. He paced my living room like a trapped animal, his breathing shallow and rapid. I watched the facade of the brilliant wealth manager shatter into pathetic pieces. He had found out about the software buyout. In his desperate scramble to find a lifeline for his collapsing finances, he had been digging through elite real estate transactions to find a high net worth client to pitch an investment to. He tracked the Apex Holdings LLC registration back to my legal representation. He knew I had cash. He knew I was closing on the massive estate. He knew he was completely out of options. Cameron collapsed onto my cheap sofa and buried his face in his hands. He confessed everything in a torrent of gasping sobs. He was not a successful wealth manager. He had leveraged everything he owned and money he did not actually have on high-risk investments that had completely tanked. He was drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. His cars were facing repossession. His credit was destroyed. Worst of all, he knew our parents expected him to provide for them as their own savings dwindled. They had spent their lives bragging about him to their country club friends, setting an impossible standard that he desperately tried to maintain with smoke and mirrors. I sat across from him feeling a strange mixture of pity and validation. For my entire life, I had been the family failure, the one who supposedly ruined everything. Yet here was the golden child sobbing on my couch, begging the dropout to save him from absolute ruin. He did not just ask for a loan. He asked for my identity. He knew I was moving our parents into the main house. He begged me to let him take the credit. He pleaded to let him sign a lease with the LLC, to let him tell our parents he secured this magnificent property for their retirement. He argued that if our parents found out he was a fraud, it would kill our father. His entire identity was wrapped up in being the successful son. He swore that if I let him be the face of this arrangement, he would work day and night to pay the discounted rent. He promised he would protect me, ensure our parents treated me well, and be forever in my debt. I stared at him, weighing my options. I could have exposed him right then. I could have called our parents and told them their perfect son was a bankrupt liar. But I looked at his shaking hands and thought about the crushing weight of our parents' expectations. I knew how toxic their disappointment could be. I also knew if they discovered my wealth, they would suddenly demand I fund their extravagant lifestyle, claiming they deserved it for raising me. They would drain me dry and still find a way to insult my choices. Letting Cameron take the credit actually solved my biggest problem. It gave my parents a beautiful home, protected my financial privacy, and maintained the delicate, superficial peace of our family dynamic. I agreed to his desperate proposal, but laid down ironclad rules. He would sign a formal, legally binding commercial lease with Apex Holdings, LLC. He would pay a heavily discounted monthly rate, just enough to cover property taxes and basic maintenance. I brought in corporate attorneys to draft a strict non-disclosure agreement. Cameron signed away his right to ever discuss my connection to the property, the LLC, or my software company. He legally bound himself to the lie he created. I gave him the shield he needed to hide his failures, expecting a modicum of respect in return. For the first few months, he was incredibly grateful. He paid rent on time and treated me with a cautious, fearful respect. But as time went on, the reality of his situation began to warp his mind. The more our parents praised him for his incredible generosity, the more he seemed to believe his own lie. He started walking around the estate like he genuinely owned it. He began making passive-aggressive comments about my presence in the guest house, playing the role of the benevolent, long-suffering brother to perfection. When his financial reality caught up with him again, and he stopped paying the rent entirely 14 months ago, his attitude did not become apologetic. It became hostile. He convinced himself that because I had so much money, I owed him a free ride. He twisted the narrative in his head until he was the victim burdened by a demanding family and a sister who had more cash than she needed. His gratitude curdled into deep, toxic resentment. He began to treat me worse than our parents did, perhaps because looking at me was a constant, humiliating reminder of his own pathetic failure. Tonight, sitting at that dining table, watching him laugh while our father called me a freeloader, I realized just how fully he had embraced the delusion. He used my silent generosity to build a towering monument to his own ego. I slowly closed the heavy physical ledger and placed it back inside the steel wall safe. I spun the combination dial, locking the truth away once more. The memory of his desperate tears in my old apartment faded, replaced by the image of his arrogant smirk from just an hour ago. He had taken my protection and used it as a weapon against me. He allowed our parents to degrade me, to scream in my face, and to threaten my sense of security, all while standing on floors that I paid for. The countdown timer on my laptop screen silently ticked away the seconds. It was a digital heartbeat, steady and unforgiving. I had given Cameron every possible chance to be a decent human being. I gave him the ultimate gift of grace, shielding him from the very judgment he so happily inflicted upon me. Now the time for grace was officially over. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the window, looking out across the dark expanse of the lawn toward the brightly lit main house. They were probably still drinking my expensive wine, laughing at my expense, completely unaware that the foundation of their perfect lives had just been detonated. I let the curtain fall closed, perfectly content to let the remaining quiet hours of the night slip away. I spent the next few hours reviewing the finalized eviction protocols. The bitter wind continued its steady howling against the siding of the guest house. I checked the digital clock on my desk. It was exactly 1 in the morning. I was just about to shut down the computer when a heavy, aggressive thud echoed from the front of the house. A second later, a series of violent pounds struck my solid wood front door. The impacts were loud and clumsy. I moved silently across the cherry wood floor toward the entryway. The bright porch light illuminated the dark silhouette of a tall figure swaying slightly on the other side of the frosted glass panels. It was Cameron. "Open the door, Valerie," he demanded, his voice slurred. I stood in the dark entryway, making no move to unlock the deadbolt. I could hear his heavy, uneven breathing. He had spent the hours since my departure consuming a significant portion of my wine collection. I stepped closer to the door, keeping my voice low so I would not wake Leo. "Go back to the main house, Cameron," I said firmly. "It is 1 in the morning. You are making a fool of yourself." My calm tone only infuriated him further. He slammed the flat of his palm against the door again. "I am not making a fool of myself," he shouted. "You humiliated me in front of Mom and Dad tonight. You stood up at my dining table and acted like you had some sort of authority in my house. You disrespected me, and I am not going to just let that slide." I stared at the blurred outline of his face through the frosted glass. "Your house," I repeated softly, shaking my head at his delusion. "Yes, my house," he snapped back. "I pay for this place. I provide for this family. You are just a charity case taking up space in my backyard. You thought you could just walk out of dinner and issue ultimatums to our father. You have absolutely zero power here. I am the one with the lease. I could make one phone call right now and have the property manager throw you and your brat onto the street." He laughed, a harsh, cruel sound. "How would you like me to call the landlord and say my deadbeat sister is causing problems on the estate?" I listened to his drunken rant, feeling an overwhelming wave of validation. Any lingering shred of guilt I might have harbored about tearing his life apart completely vanished in that exact moment. He stood on my porch, threatening to use my own property management company to make my son homeless. I did not try to correct his massive misunderstanding of the situation. I simply turned around and walked back down the hallway to my home office. I woke the high-resolution laser printer from sleep mode. I pulled up the official notice of immediate lease termination that I generated hours earlier. I hit print. The machine whirred to life, providing a rhythmic soundtrack to the barrage of insults Cameron was still shouting at my front door. The printer spat out 3 crisp pages of legal documentation. The text was printed on official watermarked paper, used specifically by Apex Holdings for corporate compliance. I gathered the warm sheets of paper, aligned them perfectly, and grabbed a heavy-duty brass paperclip to bind them together. The document detailed the 14 months of missed rent payments. It explicitly cited the hostile behavior clause. It clearly stated that the tenant, Cameron, and all occupants had exactly 12 hours to vacate the entire premises before law enforcement would arrive to enforce a physical eviction. I walked back down the hallway, the papers feeling like a physical weapon in my hands. Cameron was still leaning against the front door, muttering about how ungrateful I was. I stopped right at the threshold. "Cameron," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy oak door with clarity. "I highly recommend you step back and look down at your feet." I knelt on the hardwood floor and pushed the thick stack of watermarked documents through the wide mail slot at the bottom of the door. The paper clip scraped softly against the metal flap as the papers slid through and landed outside. The sudden movement caught his attention. I heard him grunt in confusion as he awkwardly stumbled back a step. "What is this garbage?" he muttered, his slurred voice filled with annoyance. I stood up and smoothed the front of my sweater. I waited in the dark, silent entryway as he held the papers up to the dim light of the porch fixture. I could hear the crisp pages flipping. I gave him a minute to process the bold legal headings, the financial ledger showing his massive delinquency, and the glaring 12-hour countdown timestamp printed clearly at the top. I expected the sudden panic that should accompany reading a legally binding eviction notice. Instead, what I heard next completely solidified his fate. Cameron started to laugh. It was a deep roar of genuine amusement that shattered the quiet night air. He slapped the heavy stack of papers against his thigh, dismissing the reality staring him in the face. "Oh, this is rich." He chuckled loudly, his voice dripping with contempt and drunken confidence. "This is truly pathetic, Valerie. You went back into your little home office, fired up your cheap laptop, and typed up a fake eviction notice to scare me. You printed a fake legal document from the landlord. You are completely out of your mind." He laughed harder. "Did you honestly think I would fall for this desperate little stunt? Did you think I would look at a piece of paper you slid under the door and believe you have the power to kick me out of my leased property? You are delusional and completely jealous of my success." I kept my hands resting calmly by my sides, making no effort to unlock the door or correct his fatal assumption. "If you believe it is fake, Cameron, then you have absolutely nothing to worry about," I said evenly. "Go back to the main house. Tomorrow is going to be a very busy day for you." Cameron scoffed a wet, dismissive sound. "You are pathetic," he sneered, tossing the documents back onto the porch floor. "You can clean up your own garbage tomorrow morning. I am going to bed, and when I wake up, I am calling the management company to discuss having you permanently removed from this estate. You are done here, Valerie. Enjoy your last night of charity." I listened to the heavy sound of his expensive leather shoes stomping down the wooden porch steps. I watched his shadowy figure stumble across the frosted glass as he walked away, confident in his fabricated supremacy and his perceived control over my destiny. He was marching back to the main house to sleep off his expensive wine, entirely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath his feet was already gone forever. I reached forward and flipped the heavy brass deadbolts, securing the door with a loud, satisfying click. I turned my back on the entryway and walked quietly down the hall to check on Leo one last time. The trap was set, the warning had been formally delivered, and the countdown was moving forward without mercy. All I had to do now was wait for the sun to rise. The sun broke through heavy gray clouds, just after 7 in the morning. I had barely slept, fueled by adrenaline and cold anticipation, but my mind felt remarkably clear. By 10 o'clock, the tranquil silence of the estate was shattered by the arrival of my parents' highly anticipated post-holiday brunch. They had planned this event for weeks, eager to parade their supposedly elite status in front of the most influential residents of our wealthy, affluent suburb. From the bay window of my home office, I had a perfect clear view of the main driveway and the sprawling stone patio. A valet service parked the steady stream of luxury SUVs rolling through the front gates. The catering company had set up a massive outdoor mimosa bar and a carving station under heated white tents. It was a flawless display of wealth funded entirely by credit cards they could not afford and anchored by a house they did not own. My mother, Catherine, emerged onto the back patio wearing a stunning cashmere sweater and a string of pearls. She floated from group to group with a practiced smile, holding a crystal flute of champagne. The crisp November air carried the sound of her theatrical laughter across the manicured lawn to my guest house. She was in her absolute element. I opened my window just a crack. My father, Richard, stood near the massive outdoor stone fireplace, surrounded by a captive audience of local business owners and country club regulars. He held a premium cigar in one hand and gestured expansively at the property with the other. "It is quite the property," Richard boasted, his deep voice carrying easily across the manicured grass. 3 acres of prime real estate. Cameron practically stole it when he negotiated the lease. The owner is some faceless corporate entity that clearly did not know the true value of the land. But my son has a brilliant eye for these things. He wanted the perfect place to entertain, and he absolutely delivered it. A chorus of polite murmurs rose from his audience. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a dark sense of satisfaction. My father was bragging about stealing my property, completely oblivious to the fact that the faceless corporate entity was watching him from the guest house window. Then Cameron stepped out through the massive French doors. He looked completely recovered from his drunken tantrum the night before, sporting a crisp designer blazer and expensive loafers. He moved through the crowd of wealthy neighbors with the smooth charm of a seasoned politician. He was soaking up all the adoration, feeding his insatiable ego with the lies he had carefully constructed. I watched him approach Mrs. Gable, the notoriously judgmental president of the local homeowners association. She was known for demanding absolute perfection, and my mother had spent years desperately trying to win her approval. Cameron leaned in, flashing his bright, rehearsed smile as he spoke softly. "We just wanted to create a space that reflects our family values," Cameron said smoothly. "Success is meaningless if you cannot share it with the people who raised you. I told my parents that as long as I am managing my firm, they will never have to worry about a single thing. This estate is just a small token of my appreciation." Mrs. Gable placed a hand over her heart, looking at my mother with genuine envy. "Catherine, you must be so incredibly proud," she gushed loudly. "To raise a son who is not only a financial genius but so profoundly devoted to his family. It is a rare thing these days. Most children are just a drain on their parents' resources." My mother beamed her chest, puffing out with absolute triumph. She linked her arm affectionately through Cameron's. "We are incredibly blessed, Mrs. Gable. Cameron has always been our shining star. He understands the importance of legacy. He carries the weight of this entire family on his shoulders, without a single complaint." I leaned against the cool window frame, shaking my head at the absolute absurdity of the performance. The shining star of the family was currently sitting on exactly 14 months of unpaid rent. The financial genius had secretly drained our parents' retirement accounts to fund his luxury lifestyle. He was standing on a mountain of fraud, smiling for his adoring audience, while the clock ticked mercilessly down toward his total destruction. I glanced down at my watch. It was exactly 10:15. The 12-hour eviction notice I had slid under his door the night before was counting down the final minutes. He had completely ignored the legal document, treating it like a piece of garbage, and now he was using his final hours of borrowed time to dig his grave even deeper. I stepped away from the window and walked back into the living room, where Leo was sitting on the rug, happily building a tower out of plastic blocks. I had allowed my family to manipulate me for years because I thought maintaining a close relationship was the right thing to do. But watching them revel in their cruelty last night, calling me a freeloader, had completely shattered that illusion. I crouched down next to Leo and handed him a blue block. "Are we still going on our adventure today, Mommy?" he asked, his eyes shining brightly with pure joy. I had promised him a trip to his favorite indoor water park, a perfect excuse to get him off the property before the chaos erupted. "Absolutely, sweetie," I replied softly, smoothing his hair. "We are going to have a wonderful day. Just let Mommy make a few quick phone calls and then we will head out." I walked back into my office and picked up my cell phone. I needed to confirm that every piece of my plan was perfectly aligned. I opened my contacts and dialed the direct number for my lead property manager, a tough, no-nonsense woman named Brenda, who had handled my corporate accounts for years. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. "Good morning, Valerie," Brenda said. "We have received the expedited eviction notice for the main house property. The paperwork has been fully processed and filed with the local authorities." "Are we on schedule for noon?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "We are perfectly on schedule," Brenda confirmed. "I have 2 security vehicles standing by just down the road. I also coordinated with the local sheriff's department. A deputy will be accompanying us to ensure there is no breach of the peace during the removal process. They are fully briefed on the situation." "Make sure you approach the main house exactly at noon," I instructed. "Do not wait for the brunch to end. They need to be removed immediately. The breach of contract is absolute, and I want them off my property without delay." "Understood." Brenda replied smoothly. We will execute the protocol by the book. They will be given exactly 1 hour to gather their essential belongings under strict security supervision, and then they will be escorted off the premises. I hung up the phone. The trap was firmly set, the local authorities were properly notified, and the execution team was completely ready. I walked back over to the window and looked out at the brunch one last time. My father was laughing at a stupid joke. My mother was clinking champagne glasses. Cameron was looking out over my lake. I let the heavy curtain fall completely shut, blocking out the ridiculous spectacle taking place on my patio. The time for quietly watching was over. I turned my back on the bright window and walked purposefully into my bedroom. If I was going to face my family as the true owner of this estate, I needed to shed the image of the helpless daughter they had forced upon me for the last 7 years. I walked into my walk-in closet and bypassed the faded casual jeans, the soft cotton t-shirts, and the comfortable oversized sweaters I normally wore around the small guest house. I reached for the protective armor I usually reserved for aggressive board meetings and high-stakes corporate negotiations. I pulled out a sharply tailored charcoal gray blazer and matching trousers. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and my most intimidating black heels. As I buttoned the blazer, I felt a physical shift in my posture. My spine straightened completely. My shoulders pulled back tightly. I was no longer Valerie the disappointment. I was Valerie, the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings. I applied my makeup with the same cold precision I applied to my code, focusing on sharp, clean lines that projected absolute, unyielding authority. I walked back to my desk to make the final necessary phone calls. The property management team was already mobilized, but I needed to ensure the legal fallout was completely contained before Cameron even realized what was happening. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line for David, my lead corporate attorney. He answered almost immediately. "Good morning, Valerie," David said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Good morning, David," I replied. "The 12-hour eviction notice I filed last night is set to be executed at exactly noon today. My family is currently hosting a large brunch on the property, so the removal process is going to be highly public and incredibly hostile. I need your team on high alert starting right now." "Understood," David said smoothly. "I have the entire file open on my desk. We have the signed lease agreement, the digital logs proving 14 months of non-payment, and the breach of contract clause highlighted. If your brother attempts to file an emergency injunction to halt the eviction, my team will block it instantly. He has absolutely zero legal standing to remain on the property. He is going to retaliate, I warned. He will likely hire the cheapest lawyer he can find to sue me for emotional distress or claim fake equity to extort a settlement, preemptively shut down every single avenue he might use. I will draft the cease and desist orders right now," David confirmed. "We will hit him with a countersuit for the unpaid rent the second his legal counsel reaches out. But we need to talk about his personal wealth management firm. If he is defaulting on a severely discounted residential lease, his business finances are likely in catastrophic shape. Do you want me to initiate a deeper look into his corporate filings?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Bring in the forensic accounting team. I want a complete audit of his entire business structure. I need to know whose money he is losing and how he keeps his fake lifestyle afloat. Dig into everything. Consider it done," David said. "I will have the preliminary financial report on your desk by Monday morning. Stay safe today, Valerie." I ended the call and dialed the commander of the private security firm I kept on retainer for my corporate offices. A man named Michael answered on the first ring. I gave him strict, unwavering instructions regarding the physical removal of my family. I emphasized that my father had a terrible temper, and Cameron was prone to erratic outbursts when challenged. I told Michael that under no circumstances was anyone allowed to lay a hand on my team, but the security guards were to remain entirely professional. They were there to enforce a legal boundary, not to engage in a brawl. Michael assured me his men were highly trained de-escalation experts and that the local sheriff deputy would take point on the actual eviction mandate to ensure total legal compliance. The police presence would prevent my father from trying to physically intimidate anyone. The plan was legally bulletproof. With the logistics locked down, I turned my attention to the most important part of my morning. I walked down the hall to Leo's bedroom. He was packing blocks into a backpack. I called Lauren, my trusted nanny, to take him out. I needed to ensure Leo was completely shielded from the impending explosion. He did not need to see his grandfather screaming or his uncle escorted away by security. He deserved uninterrupted joy far away from the family that never truly valued him. "Wow, Mommy, you look fancy today," Leo said, taking in my suit and heels. "Are you going to a big meeting at work?" I smiled warmly, letting the corporate coldness wash away the second I looked at my son. "No, sweetie," I replied, kneeling down to help him zip up his backpack. "Mommy just wanted to dress up today. Lauren is going to be here in a few minutes to take you to the indoor water park. Are you ready to go hit the water slides?" Leo cheered, completely forgetting about my outfit as the excitement of the water park took over. I slung his duffel bag over my shoulder and took his hand. We walked out the back door, avoiding the view of the main estate entirely. I led him down a narrow gravel path connecting to the rear service gate. Lauren was parked on the street. I buckled Leo into his booster seat, double-checking the straps to ensure he was safe, then walked around to the driver's window. "Thank you for doing this on short notice, Lauren," I said sincerely. "Take your time today. Get him dinner and ice cream afterward. I will cover all the expenses." Lauren smiled, sensing the serious tone beneath my words. "Take care of whatever you need to do, Valerie. We will have a blast." I watched her car pull away, keeping my eyes on the road until the vehicle disappeared. My son was safe, happy, and entirely removed from the upcoming battlefield. I turned and walked back up the gravel path, re-entering the guest house. I walked into my home office and sat down at my desk. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a sleek black leather presentation folder. Inside rested the property deed, the LLC incorporation papers, and the legal documents proving my absolute ownership of the $4 million estate. I closed the folder and rested my hands on top of the smooth leather. I looked at the digital clock on my computer monitor. It was 11:15 in the morning. I had exactly 45 minutes left to wait. 45 minutes until the carefully constructed lies my family built their identities upon were burned to the ground. I took a slow, deep breath, quietly relishing the absolute quiet solitude of the pristine guest house, while the chaotic brunch continued completely uninterrupted just across the sprawling lawn. Every single legal detail was perfectly in place. I just sat there in the heavy, expectant silence, staring at the screen, and waited for noon to strike. At 11:55, the silence in my office finally broke. A soft chime from my cell phone signaled a text message from Brenda. It was a simple one-line confirmation stating that the security detail and the local sheriff deputy were pulling onto the main road leading to the estate gates. They were exactly 5 minutes away. I took a deep, steadying breath and stood up from my desk. I picked up the heavy black leather presentation folder containing the property deed and the LLC incorporation papers. The smooth leather felt cool and substantial against my palms. It was the physical manifestation of every late night, every rejected loan application, every moment of doubt I had ever pushed through. I tucked the folder securely under my left arm and walked out of my office. I moved through the quiet, empty guest house, my heels clicking softly against the cherry wood floors. I paused at the entryway mirror for one final check. The woman looking back at me was composed, sharp, and entirely unbothered. I reached for the brass handle of the front door and stepped out into the crisp, biting November air. The contrast between the serene quiet of my guest house and the bustling noise of the main patio was immediate and jarring. The catering staff was weaving expertly through the crowds of wealthy suburbanites, carrying silver trays loaded with smoked salmon canapes and crystal flutes of expensive champagne. Soft jazz music played from the hidden outdoor speakers I had installed the previous summer. The heated white tents glowed warmly against the overcast gray sky, creating an artificial bubble of comfort for my parents and their oblivious friends. I began to walk slowly across the sprawling, manicured lawn. I did not rush. I took my time feeling the soft give of the expensive grass beneath the sharp points of my heels. With every step I took toward the main house, I felt a heavy, suffocating layer of my past falling away. I was shedding the identity of the family disappointment, shedding the role of the charity case, shedding the pathetic narrative they had forced me to wear for 7 years. I was walking across my own land, approaching my own house, preparing to reclaim my own life. As I drew closer to the edge of the stone patio, I noticed that the crowd was clustered heavily around the outdoor fireplace. My mother Catherine was holding court with a group of women draped in designer winterwear. Mrs. Gable, the Homeowners Association president, was standing right beside her, nodding vigorously at whatever story my mother was spinning. I stopped near the edge of the catering tent, remaining perfectly still as I observed them. I wanted to soak in this final moment of their grand delusion. Cameron was standing a few yards away, laughing loudly with a local real estate developer projecting the image of a titan of industry. My father Richard was near the outdoor bar, signaling the bartender for another pour of top-shelf bourbon. They were completely intoxicated by their own fake status, entirely convinced that they ruled this little corner of the world. It took exactly 2 minutes for my mother to notice me. She had been gesturing broadly with her champagne flute, likely exaggerating another one of Cameron's supposed financial victories, when her sharp eyes locked onto my figure standing near the tent. The easy practice smile on her face vanished instantly. Her posture went rigid. I saw her eyes dart up and down, taking in my tailored charcoal gray suit, my crisp white silk blouse, and my professional demeanor. This was not the oversized sweater and faded jeans she was accustomed to seeing me wear. This was a direct threat to the narrative she had carefully constructed for her friends. I did not look away. I held her gaze with absolute unyielding calm. Catherine quickly turned back to Mrs. Gable, but her voice immediately rose in volume. It was a deliberate, calculated shift in tone, designed to ensure that everyone in their immediate circle, and especially me, could hear every single word. She plastered a deeply sympathetic, patronizing look on her face and placed a hand on Mrs. Gable's arm. "I do apologize for the interruption," Helen, my mother, sighed loudly, projecting her voice across the patio. "But it seems my daughter has decided to wander out of the guest house. She has always struggled so much with boundaries. You know how difficult it can be with children who simply refuse to launch. We try to give Valerie as much grace as possible considering her unfortunate situation, but sometimes her lack of social awareness is just completely exhausting." Mrs. Gable turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a sickening mixture of pity and judgment. "Oh, Catherine, you are practically a saint," Mrs. Gable cooed, shaking her head sadly. "I simply do not know how you and Richard manage the stress. It must be so incredibly draining to have a grown child still clinging to your apron strings, especially when you have a son as remarkably successful and independent as Cameron. You provide her with a free roof over her head, and she repays you by loitering around your private events." My mother nodded tragically, taking another sip of her champagne. "We do our best, Helen. We really do. We convinced Cameron to let her stay in the back property out of pure charity. We keep hoping that being around our successful friends might finally inspire her to do something meaningful with her life, but some people are just perfectly content to live off the hard work of their betters. It breaks a mother's heart truly." I stood my ground, my hands resting lightly on the leather folder tucked under my arm. The sheer venom in her words was astounding, yet it did not hurt me. For the first time in my life, her cruel public humiliation felt completely hollow. It was nothing more than the desperate flailing of a woman who had built her entire identity on a throne of lies. She was performing for an audience of strangers, using my supposed failure as a prop to elevate her own status. I did not interrupt her performance. I let her dig the hole as deep as she possibly could. I wanted her to commit fully to the lie, ensuring that the impending crash would be absolute and unforgiving. The sound of my mother's raised theatrical voice had drawn the attention of my father. Richard turned away from the outdoor bar, his heavy brow furrowing in deep annoyance as he spotted me standing near the edge of his pristine gathering. He marched across the stone patio, his heavy footsteps thudding against the expensive pavers. He pushed his way past a group of chatting neighbors, not bothering to offer polite excuses. His face was flushing a deep, angry shade of red, the same color it had turned the night before when he screamed at me in the dining room. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me, using his physical size to try and intimidate me into submission. "What exactly do you think you are doing out here, Valerie?" My father demanded, his voice a harsh, aggressive whisper meant only for my ears. "We have important guests. We are entertaining people who actually matter in this community. You have absolutely no business being on this patio dressed up like you belong here. You are going to ruin this entire brunch with your pathetic, gloomy presence." I looked up at him, my expression perfectly neutral. "I am simply enjoying the fresh air, Richard," I replied smoothly. "It is a beautiful day for a walk around the estate." His eyes widened in shock at my use of his first name. I had never addressed him so casually, so disrespectfully in my entire life. His jaw clenched and the veins in his neck stood out in sharp relief. He leaned in closer, trying to force me to back down. "Do not play games with me," he hissed viciously. "I do not care what you think you are doing, but it ends right now. Turn around, walk back to that guest house and lock the door behind you. You are embarrassing your mother, you are embarrassing your brother, and you are embarrassing me. Go back inside and stay out of sight before I have Cameron call the property manager to drag you off this land." I did not take a single step back. I did not flinch, and I did not break eye contact. I slowly lifted my left wrist, pulling back the cuff of my tailored blazer. I looked down at the sleek, minimalist face of my watch. The silver second hand swept methodically across the black dial. I watched it move with absolute focus. 5 seconds, 4 seconds, 3 seconds. I looked back up at my father, staring him dead in the eye with a cold, unwavering intensity that made him momentarily falter. I let the silence stretch between us, heavy and electric. The ambient noise of the brunch seemed to fade entirely into the background. "It is exactly 12 o'clock, I said softly. Before Richard could even open his mouth to demand what I was talking about, the heavy wrought iron front gates of the estate began to slowly swing open. The mechanical groan of the expensive motors echoed across the front drive, cutting through the jazz music playing on the patio speakers. The distant heavy crunch of tires on gravel signaled the arrival of the execution team. The time for warnings was officially over. 2 massive, heavily tinted, blacked-out luxury SUVs rolled smoothly up the long, winding, tree-lined driveway, their heavy tires grinding loudly against the pristine white gravel. The sudden sound cut through the soft jazz music and the polite, muted chatter of the brunch guests like a sharp blade. Heads began to turn one by one. Conversations halted mid-sentence as the wealthy neighbors lowered their champagne flutes, their brows furrowing in collective confusion. This was a highly exclusive, gated community where uninvited guests simply did not exist. The vehicles moved with a deliberate, synchronized precision that commanded immediate attention. They did not park in the designated guest area near the front gardens. Instead, they pulled directly onto the expansive circular turnaround, right at the base of the main patio steps, blocking the catering vans and asserting absolute physical dominance over the space. My father stared at the vehicles, his face twisting from anger directed at me into a mask of deep, offended bewilderment. He lowered his hand from where he had been pointing at my face and took a step toward the edge of the patio. He clearly thought this was some sort of colossal mistake by a lost delivery service or a confused contractor. I remained perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the leather folder tucked under my arm, watching the flawless execution of my instructions unfold. The heavy doors of the lead SUV swung open in perfect unison. Michael, the commander of my private security detail, stepped out first. He wore a sharp, tactical black suit, an earpiece resting visibly against his jaw, and an expression of absolute, unyielding authority. 2 more security professionals exited the rear doors, mirroring his imposing stance. They fanned out across the base of the stone steps, effectively securing the primary exit route from the patio. From the second vehicle, a uniformed local sheriff deputy stepped out into the crisp November air. The sight of the polished silver badge pinned to his chest and the heavy-duty utility belt at his waist sent an immediate visible shockwave through the crowd of country club elites. The remaining murmurs of conversation instantly died out, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. Finally, Brenda emerged from the passenger side of the second SUV. My lead property manager looked magnificent. She wore a tailored navy blue pantsuit and carried a thick, official-looking clipboard pressed firmly against her chest. Her posture was rigidly professional, completely unaffected by the blatant stares of the millionaires gathered on the lawn. She took point walking purposefully up the wide stone steps toward the patio flanked closely by the sheriff deputy and Michael. The sheer gravity of their unified approach made the catering staff instinctively step back, clearing a wide path directly to the center of the gathering. My father finally found his voice, stepping forward to intercept them with his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of territorial bravado. "Excuse me," Richard barked, his deep voice cracking slightly as he tried to project maximum authority. "What on earth do you think you are doing? This is a private residence. We are hosting a private event. You have absolutely no right to drive your vehicles onto this patio. I demand that you turn around and leave my property this instant." Brenda did not even blink. She stopped exactly 4 feet away from my father, planting her feet firmly on the expensive stone pavers. She looked him up and down with cold, clinical detachment. Richard was visibly shaking now, his face flushing a bright, furious red, as the humiliation of being challenged in front of his wealthy peers began to set in. Cameron, realizing that a major scene was unfolding, quickly shoved his way through the crowd of guests. He jogged over to stand beside our father, attempting to flash his signature arrogant smile to diffuse the tension. "Gentlemen, please," Cameron said smoothly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "There has obviously been some sort of administrative error here. I am the primary leaseholder of this estate. My name is Cameron, and I manage the wealth portfolio that secures this property. If you have some sort of delivery or service issue, you need to take it around to the service entrance at the back. You are frightening my parents' guests." Brenda looked directly at Cameron. She did not lower her voice to accommodate his fragile ego or to spare the feelings of the gossiping neighbors leaning in to listen. She spoke with a loud, clear, and perfectly enunciated tone that carried to the very back of the catering tents. "I am looking for the legal occupants of this property," Brenda announced, her voice echoing off the stone walls of the main house. "I am the senior representative of Apex Holdings, LLC, the corporate entity that holds the deed to this entire estate." Cameron's arrogant smile vanished instantly. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. He took a stumbling step backward, his eyes darting frantically toward the security guards and the armed deputy. He knew that name. He knew exactly what was happening, and the sheer terror of his collapsing reality was written all over his sweating forehead. Brenda unclipped a thick stack of watermarked legal documents from her board. She held them up for everyone to see. "As the authorized representative of Apex Holdings, I am here to formally announce the immediate and absolute termination of your residential lease agreement. This action is being executed due to critical, prolonged violations of the binding contract signed exactly 24 months ago." My mother let out a loud, high-pitched gasp. She dropped her crystal champagne flute. The glass shattered violently against the stone patio, sending shards flying across the ground. But nobody even looked down. Every single eye was glued to Brenda. "What are you talking about?" My father roared, spittle flying from his lips. "We do not have any violations. My son pays a fortune to lease this house. He is a premier client. You are completely out of your mind." Brenda did not flinch at his shouting. She simply flipped to the second page of her document and began to read the formal eviction mandate with ruthless precision. "This eviction is being enforced due to extreme and hostile behavior directed toward the property owner," Brenda stated clearly, letting the words sink into the silent crowd. "Furthermore, the tenant has committed massive financial delinquency. Specifically, you have failed to render any rent payments for 14 consecutive months. You are currently in default to the sum of tens of thousands of dollars." The guests gasped in unison. The extremely wealthy neighbors who had just spent the entire last hour loudly praising Cameron as a brilliant financial genius now stared at him in absolute horror. The whispers broke out immediately, spreading like wildfire across the patio. Therefore, Brenda concluded, slowly lowering the heavy clipboard and staring directly into Cameron's utterly terrified eyes. By the strict legal authority granted under the breach of contract clause, you and your entire family are hereby ordered to completely vacate these premises immediately. You have exactly 1 hour to carefully gather your essential belongings under the strict supervision of this private security detail. If you are not entirely off this property in 60 minutes, the sheriff deputy will physically place you under arrest for criminal trespassing. Your time starts right now. Do not attempt to resist this lawful order. The echo of Brenda's final word hung over the patio like a death sentence. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody dared to breathe. The wealthy neighbors stood frozen in place, their eyes darting between Brenda's clipboard and my family. Then the shock shattered and absolute chaos erupted. My father stepped forward, his face twisting into a furious snarl as he turned his wrath onto my brother, Cameron. Richard bellowed, his voice cracking under the intense strain. What is this woman talking about? Tell them this is a massive mistake. Fix this administrative error right now before I call my own lawyers. My mother rushed to my father's side, her hands trembling as she smoothed the front of her expensive cashmere sweater. She cast a desperate, pleading look at Mrs. Gable, attempting to salvage whatever tiny shred of social standing she had left. It is just a bank glitch, Helen, Catherine stammered, her voice pitched high and tight with panic. You know how these massive corporate entities operate. They mix up routing numbers and suddenly send armed guards to terrorize innocent people. Cameron will straighten this out in 5 minutes. He handles billions of dollars. Cameron looked like he was going to vomit. The perfectly tailored designer suit he wore suddenly seemed 2 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. He wiped a thick layer of sweat from his forehead, his eyes darting frantically, looking for an escape route that simply did not exist. The brilliant, unstoppable wealth manager was completely paralyzed. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, pathetic croak came out. The neighbors were murmuring loudly now, pointing their fingers and leaning in to watch the incredible spectacle unfolding on the stone patio. Do something, my father roared, shoving Cameron hard on the shoulder. You are the primary leaseholder. Tell them who you are. Throw them off our land. Cameron stumbled forward from the force of our father's shove. He swallowed hard, forcing a sickeningly fake, incredibly strained smile onto his face as he approached Brenda. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, attempting to project the calm, collected demeanor of a powerful executive handling a minor inconvenience. He stepped dangerously close to the property manager, trying to bridge the gap and force the conversation into a private, hushed whisper away from the prying ears of the country club gossips. Look, Brenda, is it? Cameron began, dropping his voice to a low, desperate mumble. Let us just take a breath and step inside the main house for a minute. We can go into the study and discuss this like rational adults. There has obviously been a massive miscommunication regarding the wire transfers from my primary holding accounts. I can show you the paperwork inside. Let us just get these police officers off my lawn and resolve this quietly over a cup of coffee. Michael, the commander of my private security detail, instantly stepped between Cameron and Brenda. He planted his large frame directly in my brother's path, folding his hands neatly in front of his tactical suit. The local sheriff deputy placed a firm hand on his utility belt, sending a very clear, unspoken message. Cameron froze, his fake smile dropping completely as he looked up at the towering security guard blocking his path. We are not stepping inside, Sir Brenda replied, her voice remaining at a sharp, commanding volume. We are not having a cup of coffee, and we are certainly not discussing your imaginary offshore accounts. You are currently trespassing on property owned by Apex Holdings. You have 55 minutes remaining to vacate before you are forcibly removed in handcuffs. Desperation completely overrode Cameron's pride. He reached a trembling hand inside his expensive blazer and pulled out a slim, leather-bound checkbook. His fingers shook violently as he fumbled for a gold-plated pen in his chest pocket. He looked around wildly at the audience of wealthy neighbors, then leaned as close to Brenda as the security guard would allow. Okay, listen to me, Cameron, hissed, his voice cracking with pure panic. I will write you a personal check right now. I will write it for the entire 14 months of back rent. I will include whatever ridiculous late fees your company wants to charge. I will even throw in a cash bonus for you personally if you just take your men and leave this property immediately. Just give me a number and I will write the check right this second. Do not do this to me in front of these people, please. He was begging. The golden child, the financial genius, the man who had stood on my porch just hours earlier, threatening to make me homeless, was now pleading for his life. He uncapped the gold pen, clicking it rapidly against the leather checkbook cover, waiting for Brenda to give him a figure. My father watched this desperate exchange with mounting horror. Richard was starting to understand that his son was not demanding respect from a confused employee. His son was groveling. Brenda looked down at the leather checkbook trembling in Cameron's hands. She did not lower her voice. She did not lean in to accommodate his pathetic request for privacy. Instead, she took a deliberate step to the side, ensuring that she had a clear line of sight to my parents and the entire crowd of breathless, eavesdropping neighbors. When she spoke, her voice rang out with crystal-clear, devastating authority. "Your personal check is completely worthless," Cameron Brenda announced, projecting her words so perfectly that they echoed against the stone facade of the mansion. The crowd gasped collectively. My mother grabbed my father's arm to steady herself. "I will not accept a personal check from you because you do not have any money," Brenda continued ruthlessly. "We have the complete financial history of your interactions with Apex Holdings. Your checks have bounced consecutively for 14 months due to insufficient funds. Your bank accounts are entirely overdrawn. You do not manage wealth. You are practically bankrupt and you have been living on this estate entirely on the unacknowledged charity of the property owner." The silence that followed that declaration was absolute and profound. It was the sound of a total social execution. Mrs. Gable let out a shocked, scandalized squeak and physically took a step away from my mother, as if financial ruin were a highly contagious disease. The other neighbors immediately followed suit, creating a wide, empty circle of isolation around my parents and my brother. "You are lying!" my father screamed, his voice breaking into a high, hysterical pitch. He lunged forward, grabbing Cameron by the lapels of his tailored suit and shaking him violently. "Tell her she is lying, Cameron. Tell these people she is a liar. Show them your accounts. Tell them about your firm." Cameron did not fight back. He dropped the leather checkbook onto the stone patio, the gold pen clattering loudly against the pavers. He looked at our father with eyes completely hollowed out by fear and shame. He had absolutely nothing left to say. His entire world, built meticulously on lies, forged documents, and stolen valor, had just been vaporized in front of the most important people in his life. Brenda looked at her watch with absolute indifference. "You now have 50 minutes to gather your essential items. I strongly suggest you stop wasting time. The sheriff deputy will escort you into the main house to supervise your packing." My father released Cameron's jacket, staggering backward, as if he had been physically struck. He looked around the patio, his eyes wide and wild, searching desperately for anyone who could fix this impossible nightmare. He looked at the caterers, he looked at the security guards, he looked at the stunned neighbors. Then his frantic gaze finally swept across the lawn and landed squarely on me. I was still standing exactly where I had been since the SUVs arrived, perfectly composed, wearing my charcoal gray suit, watching the destruction with cold, unwavering focus. Richard's face twisted into pure, misdirected rage. He raised a trembling finger, pointing it aggressively in my direction, as if my presence on the lawn had manifested this disaster. But his attention snapped back to Brenda. His mind scrambled to find any clerical error that could preserve his social standing. "Who is in charge of this ridiculous company?" Richard demanded, his voice echoing shrilly across the stone patio. "I demand to speak to the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings immediately. Whoever owns this company is going to hear from me. I will personally ensure they are sued into total bankruptcy for this unbelievable insult. Get your boss on the phone right this second." Brenda did not reach for her phone or look at the security guards. She simply turned her head and looked directly at me. The sheriff deputy followed her gaze. Michael and the other security professionals turned their attention toward me as well. Slowly, methodically, the entire crowd of wealthy neighbors, caterers, and disgraced family members followed their line of sight. Suddenly, Every single pair of eyes on the patio was locked onto me. I tightened my grip on the black leather presentation folder tucked under my arm and took my first step forward. My black heels clicked sharply against the stone pavers as I moved off the grass and onto the patio. The crowd of country club elites instinctively parted, creating a wide, unobstructed path leading directly to the center of the gathering where my family stood in ruin. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a woman who held absolute power over everything in her line of sight. My mother watched me approach nervously, clutching her pearl necklace. Her eyes darted from my tailored charcoal suit to the heavily armed security guards standing down as I passed them. Confusion warped her features, unable to comprehend why the authority figures invading her brunch were suddenly deferring to her massive disappointment of a daughter. Richard breathed heavily, his chest heaving with exertion and fury, waiting for me to step aside so Brenda could answer his demand. But I did not step aside. I walked right up to the catered brunch table positioned between my father and the property management team. I stopped, planting my feet firmly on the stone. I looked at Cameron first. He had not moved from where he stood beside the dropped checkbook. He was staring at the leather folder under my arm with a look of absolute horror. He knew exactly what it was. The drunken bravado from the night before was entirely gone, replaced by the shivering, pathetic reality of a man who knew he was finally caught. "You demanded to speak to the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Holdings," I said, my voice cutting through the tense silence of the patio. It was not a shout. It was a calm, steady declaration that carried immense weight. I placed the heavy black leather folder squarely in the center of the brunch table, pushing aside a silver platter of pastries to make room. Richard stared at me, his face caught in a bizarre state of suspended animation. "What are you babbling about, Valerie?" he snapped, though his voice lacked its usual booming confidence. "This is adult business. Stay out of it and go back to the guest house before you make this worse." I did not break eye contact with my father as I reached forward and flipped the leather cover open. I took the thick stack of legal documents and spread them out across the white linen tablecloth for everyone to see. "There is no administrative error," I said, my tone completely flat and unforgiving. "There is no corporate glitch. My name is Valerie. I am the sole owner, founder, and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, LLC. I bought this entire $4 million estate 2 years ago completely in cash, using the profits from the sale of my logistics software company." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of neighbors. Mrs. Gable covered her mouth with both hands, staring at the documents displaying my name in bold legal print. My mother let out a strangled sound, staggering backward until she bumped against the stone bar. Her knees seemed to buckle slightly under the weight of the revelation. "You are lying," Richard whispered, his eyes darting frantically to the papers on the table. "This is impossible. You do not have that kind of money. You are a single mother. You dropped out of college. You are a freeloader." I pointed to the heavy watermarked property deed resting next to the crystal champagne flutes. "Read the deed," Richard I commanded, dropping the respectful title of father completely. "Read the articles of incorporation. Read the signature on the commercial lease agreement your beloved son signed with my corporate entity. I am not a freeloader. I am the landlord." Cameron let out a pathetic whimpering sob. He sank down onto a nearby patio chair and buried his face in his hands, unable to witness the destruction of his lies. I turned my gaze to my mother, who was currently staring at me as if I were a ghost. For 2 years, I allowed Cameron to pretend he was the wealthy benefactor. I explained clearly, making sure the entire crowd heard every single word. He came to my apartment crying because he was drowning in debt from terrible investments. He begged me to let him sign a fake lease so he could look like a hero to his country club friends. I agreed out of pity, under the strict condition that he actually pay the heavily discounted property taxes. Instead, he stopped paying entirely 14 months ago. Catherine shook her head rapidly, trying to reject the reality crashing down around her. "No!" she gasped, her voice trembling violently. "Cameron is successful. Cameron takes care of us. You are making this up because you are jealous." Brenda stepped forward, tapping her clipboard. "The documents on the table are completely legally binding, ma'am," the property manager stated with professional coldness. Valerie is the absolute owner of this estate. Your son is a delinquent tenant who is currently facing severe legal action for breach of contract. My father looked down at the property deed. His eyes scanned the legal text reading my full name listed as the sole proprietor. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking frail, old, and utterly defeated. His hands began to shake as the magnitude of his massive mistake finally registered in his brain. The daughter he had mocked, screamed at, and humiliated for 7 years was a self-made millionaire. The son he worshipped was a bankrupt fraud. And they were all living under my roof. Last night you sat at my dining room table and told me I was a pathetic charity case, I said, bringing my attention back to Richard. You screamed in my face and told me I contributed absolutely nothing to this family. You allowed Cameron to threaten me with eviction from my own property. I told you that you had 12 hours to leave. You laughed at me. I looked down at my silver watch and then back up at my parents. It is now 12:10 in the afternoon. Your time is officially up. You are trespassing on my private property. Please proceed with the eviction protocols immediately. Remove these trespassers from my home. Brenda nodded forcibly, concluding their pathetic delusion completely forever. Michael signaled the 2 security professionals near the patio steps. They moved forward instantly, closing the distance to my paralyzed family. There was no aggressive physical contact, just the intimidating presence of professionals enforcing a lawful boundary. Michael instructed my parents and brother to move inside the main house to gather their essential items. He handed my father a stack of thick black contractor trash bags. The visual impact of handing luxury-obsessed Richard a roll of garbage bags in front of his elite social circle was profoundly devastating. My father stared in the black plastic as if it were poison. He opened his mouth to argue, to demand proper moving boxes or a time extension, but the cold look in Michael's eyes stopped him dead. Defeated, Richard turned and walked toward the French doors like a condemned man. Cameron followed blindly, his expensive leather loafers scraping against the stone pavers, his body hunched over in total defeat. My mother was the last to move. She looked frantically around the patio, pleading for someone to step forward and intervene. "Helen," my mother cried out, taking a desperate step toward Mrs. Gable. "Please, you have to help us make sense of this. You know we are good people." Mrs. Gable took 3 rapid steps backward, clutching her designer handbag against her chest. She did not offer a single word of comfort. She simply turned her head away, her nose wrinkling in disgust, and ignored my mother's pathetic plea. The wealthy suburbanites, who just minutes ago eagerly drank my champagne, now looked at my family like they were absolute strangers. They pulled out their cell phones, spreading the scandalous news across their exclusive social networks. My mother let out a small, broken sob. With her social standing officially destroyed, she turned and fled into the main house, her hands covering her face. I remained on the patio, watching the caterers silently pack up the brunch stations. The party was officially over. I had zero desire to watch them frantically stuff their designer clothes into plastic trash bags. I let my security team handle the degrading process. For the next 50 minutes, I stood near the edge of the lake, listening to the soft rippling of the water, enjoying the absolute peace of my property. Exactly 50 minutes later, the heavy front doors of the mansion swung wide open. The walk of shame began. My father, the man who had always demanded total submission, was struggling to carry 3 bulging black garbage bags over his shoulders. His face was a mask of pure humiliation. Cameron followed close behind, dragging 2 plastic bags that clinked loudly with the sound of his luxury watches thrown haphazardly inside. My mother walked at the rear, weeping openly, her mascara running down her cheeks. They loaded their pathetic black bags into Cameron's leased luxury sedan. The irony was absolutely striking. They were packing garbage bags into a car he did not even own, preparing to drive away from a house he had pretended to lease. The security vehicles pulled up close behind them, ready to escort them off the premises and ensure they did not return. As Cameron started the engine, my father rolled down the passenger side window. He looked across the vast front lawn, his eyes searching, until they found me near the edge of the driveway. He did not yell or make threats. He just stared at me with a look of profound, devastating realization. He finally understood he had backed the wrong child. He had poured his entire life, pride and love, into a son who had completely ruined him, while treating the daughter who actually held all the power like dirt. I did not wave or smile. I simply stood my ground and watched as Cameron put the car in drive. The leased sedan rolled slowly down the long gravel driveway, flanked tightly by the two black security SUVs. The heavy wrought iron gates swung open to let them out, then closed firmly behind them, with a loud, definitive metallic clang. The estate was finally quiet. The toxic infection that had plagued my property for 2 years was officially removed. Later that afternoon, Michael returned to my home office to provide the final security briefing. He stood in front of my desk and delivered the exact details of their departure. His men had followed Cameron's vehicle to ensure they fully vacated the local jurisdiction. They had not gone to a luxury hotel downtown. They had not reached out to any of their wealthy friends for a place to crash. With Cameron's bank accounts completely overdrawn and my parents lacking emergency funds, they were forced to drive to a cheap rundown roadside motel located right off the interstate highway miles away. Michael described the scene objectively, but the image painted a vivid picture of despair. The motel had peeling exterior paint, flickering neon signs, and a parking lot littered with broken glass. It was a place designed for transient strangers, not local elites. My parents had been forced to carry their black garbage bags through a dingy lobby, checking into a cramped, miserable room that smelled of stale smoke and harsh cleaning chemicals. Richard and Catherine, who had spent their entire morning boasting about their massive estate and brilliant son, were now sitting on cheap, lumpy mattresses in a dismal motel room completely stripped of their dignity. The social execution they experienced on my patio was only the beginning of their nightmare. As the evening progressed, I opened my laptop and monitored the fallout. While I had demanded anonymity regarding my ownership of the estate, my family's disgraceful exit was entirely public. News travels at blinding speed in wealthy suburban circles. The country club group chats, community forums, and neighborhood networks were absolutely exploding with the scandalous details of the fake brunch and the dramatic security eviction. My mother, desperate to salvage some fragment of her shattered reputation, initiated a damage control campaign from her dingy motel room. Through the digital grapevine of mutual acquaintances, I watched her frantic efforts fail in real time. She tried calling Mrs. Gable and the other influential women from the neighborhood. Every call went straight to voicemail. She sent long, desperate text messages, begging for a chance to explain the terrible misunderstanding. The messages were left unread. The people my parents had spent years trying to impress, the people they had prioritized over their own daughter, severed ties with ruthless efficiency. In their status-obsessed world, financial fraud and public humiliation were unforgivable sins. By dinner time, my parents had been actively removed from the country club's social registry. Their numbers were permanently blocked by the neighbors they had invited to my property. They were entirely excommunicated from the elite circle they had sacrificed my mental health for. They were sitting in a cheap motel room, completely isolated, staring at their silent cell phones, finally realizing the true cost of their arrogance. The morning after the eviction, I sat at the kitchen island in the guest house, sipping my coffee and watching the digital fallout unfold on my laptop screen. The sheer speed at which my family chose to publicly detonate their remaining shreds of dignity was astounding. My mother had clearly decided that if she could not control the narrative in person, she would dominate it online. Catherine had taken to every social media platform available, launching a coordinated, vicious smear campaign designed to paint me as the ultimate villain. I clicked on a long, rambling post she had published on a popular neighborhood community board. The text was filled with dramatic capitalization and excessive exclamation points. She wrote a heartbreaking fictional story about how she and my father had sacrificed everything to raise me, only to be cast out onto the street in their old age. She completely omitted the fact that I was the legal owner of the estate. Instead, she claimed that I had manipulated a technical loophole to steal the property out from under Cameron, who was just trying to provide a loving home for his elderly parents. She called me a heartless monster, an elder abuser, and a greedy opportunist who was poisoning the local community. The comments section was a battlefield. Some of the wealthy neighbors who had witnessed the eviction firsthand chimed in quickly, correcting my mother's fabricated timeline and pointing out Cameron's public humiliation regarding his bounced checks. But others, people who thrived on suburban drama and only knew my family superficially, offered my mother deep sympathy and outrage on her behalf. They called for boycotts of whatever business I supposedly ran and demanded that the Homeowners Association investigate my aggressive tactics. I took a slow breath, letting the venomous words wash over me without absorbing their poison. 5 years ago, a public attack like this would have sent me into a desperate spiral of anxiety. I would have drafted a dozen defensive responses trying to prove my innocence to strangers. Now, I simply took meticulous screenshots of every single defamatory post, archiving them in a secure digital folder. She was essentially handing my legal team a pristine, fully documented case for libel and defamation. She was so blinded by her fury and her desperate need to play the victim that she was leaving a massive trail of actionable evidence. While my mother was busy waging war on the internet, Cameron decided to take a more aggressive legal route. Just before noon, a sharp knock on the door of the guest house signaled the arrival of a local process server. He handed me a thick, poorly bound stack of legal documents. I signed for them, thanked the man, and carried the papers back to my desk. I opened the file and began to read through the initial filings. Cameron had managed to find a discount predatory lawyer willing to take on an absolutely baseless lawsuit. The paperwork was a masterclass in desperate fabrication. He was officially suing Apex Holdings, LLC, and me personally for $5 million. He claimed that despite the written lease agreement he had established, sweat equity in the estate by managing the property and coordinating maintenance. He alleged that his contributions far exceeded the value of the rent he supposedly owed. Furthermore, the lawsuit demanded a massive payout for the severe emotional distress and public humiliation caused by the sudden eviction, arguing that the 12-hour notice was illegal and intentionally designed to destroy his professional reputation as a wealth manager. I read through the ridiculous claims, shaking my head at the sheer audacity of his strategy. He was completely broke, living in a dingy motel, yet he was trying to sue the person who held the receipts for his 14 months of financial delinquency. He truly believed that if he made enough noise and threw enough legal threats in my direction, I would panic and offer him a quiet, lucrative settlement just to make the headache go away. He still thought I was the weak, compliant sister who would fold under pressure to keep the peace. I picked up my phone and called David, my lead corporate attorney. "I sent you a scanned copy of the lawsuit Cameron just filed," I said, keeping my voice calm and analytical. "He is demanding $5 million for sweat equity and emotional distress." David chuckled softly on the other end of the line. "I am looking at it right now, Valerie. This is honestly one of the most pathetic legal filings I have ever seen. The lawyer he hired is notorious for taking on frivolous cases just to squeeze settlement money out of deep pockets. The claims of sweat equity are completely voided by the explicit terms of the commercial lease he signed, which clearly states that all property improvements belong solely to Apex Holdings. The emotional distress claim is laughable considering we have full documentation of his hostile behavior and his 14 months of financial default. We are not settling David," I stated firmly, leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "We are not offering him a single dime to go away. I want you to file an immediate motion to dismiss this lawsuit with prejudice. Countersue for the entire amount of back rent, the late penalties, and all associated legal fees. I also want you to formally notify his attorney that if they proceed with this frivolous action, we will pursue sanctions against their firm for filing a malicious lawsuit without any factual basis." "Understood," David replied, his tone shifting into full corporate combat mode. "I will have the motions filed before the end of the day. But Valerie, there is something else we need to discuss. The forensic accounting team has finished their preliminary audit of Cameron's wealth management firm. The results are significantly worse than we anticipated." I leaned forward in my chair, giving him my complete attention. "What did they find?" I asked, feeling a cold knot of anticipation tighten in my stomach. David paused for a second, clearly organizing the severity of the information. "Cameron's business is entirely a facade, Valerie. He does not manage high net worth clients. The few legitimate accounts he had were closed over a year ago due to catastrophic losses from his aggressive high-risk trading strategies. He has been covering his tracks by shuffling money between heavily leveraged credit accounts and taking out high-interest personal loans. That explains why he stopped paying rent. I noted tracing a line on the wood grain of my desk. But how has he been maintaining the luxury cars and the designer suits for the last 14 months? If he has no income and no credit left, where is the cash coming from? There was a heavy, ominous silence on the line. When David spoke again, his voice was gravely serious. This is the part that is going to destroy your parents, Valerie. We traced a series of large, consistent cash transfers flowing into Cameron's personal checking accounts over the last 18 months. The money is coming directly from Richard and Catherine's primary retirement portfolios. I felt the air leave my lungs. What I breathed staring blankly at the screen of my laptop. Are you saying they are voluntarily funding his fake lifestyle? It is much worse than that, David corrected grimly. The forensic team found highly irregular authorization forms linked to these transfers. The signatures on the withdrawal requests do not match the verified signatures we have on file for your parents. Based on the digital footprints and the routing paths, it is highly probable that Cameron has been forging their signatures to authorize these massive withdrawals. He has been systematically draining their retirement accounts to fund his own personal expenses. The magnitude of his betrayal settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. He had not just lied to them about being a successful provider, he had actively robbed them blind. My parents had spent the last 2 years bragging to their country club friends about their brilliant, wealthy son, entirely unaware that the luxury lifestyle he flaunted was built directly on the ashes of their own financial security. He had stripped them of everything they had worked for, and they were currently sitting in a cheap roadside motel, aggressively defending the exact person who had completely ruined their lives. The silence in my office was profound. I sat frozen, my hand gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. The devastation took my breath away. I expected Cameron to be a liar who manipulated his way into free rent. I expected him to be drowning in credit card debt. I never anticipated he would cross the line into federal financial crimes by robbing our parents of their life savings. Are you certain about the forged signatures, David? I asked in a harsh whisper. I needed this to be bulletproof. If there is even a margin of error, he will spin it into a simple misunderstanding. Top-tier forensic accountants are looking at the raw data right now, David replied with absolute certainty. The documents were electronically signed from an IP address, mapped directly to Cameron's personal office. He used his status as their supposed wealth manager to bypass the standard security protocols at the brokerage firm. It is a textbook case of wire fraud, identity theft, and elder financial abuse. The paper trail is radioactive. A heavy wave of realization washed over me. My parents had spent my entire life measuring my worth against Cameron's fabricated perfection. They called me a freeloader while I sat quietly managing my own legitimate success. They blindly handed their entire future over to a son who viewed them as nothing more than a convenient ATM to fund his leased sports cars. It was a tragedy of their own making, born from their toxic obsession with social status. They worshipped the illusion of wealth so intensely they never verified the reality. Package the audit into a single physical file, I instructed David, my mind shifting into strategic execution. I do not want this sent over email where his discount lawyer can try to bury it. Bring the complete forensic report, the forged transfer authorizations, and the routing numbers to the mediation meeting tomorrow. We are sliding the physical proof right across the table. David agreed immediately. I will have it bound and ready. We are going to decimate his ridiculous sweat equity lawsuit the second he opens his mouth. I ended the call. The rage that had been simmering inside me had completely vanished, replaced by an icy surgical focus. Cameron had thrown down the gauntlet by suing me and demanding $5 million. He was trying to use the legal system to bully me into submission, unaware that he had just invited my corporate legal team to rip his entire life wide open. He was walking into a trap of his own design. I spent the evening ignoring the continued alerts from my mother's unhinged social media campaign. Let her post her fabricated stories to the neighborhood message boards. Let her gather the empty sympathy of strangers who would forget about her the moment the next suburban scandal broke. Her digital tantrums were completely meaningless now. She was fighting a war of public perception while a literal financial bomb was ticking right under her chair. The next morning dawned bright and bitterly cold. The sky was a pale, cloudless blue, offering no warmth to the frost-covered grounds of the estate. I woke up feeling remarkably rested. The anxiety that used to plague me before family confrontations was entirely gone. Today was not about defending myself. Today was about delivering the undeniable truth. I walked into my closet and selected a sharp, tailored navy blue suit. It projected quiet, unyielding authority. I paired it with a white blouse and black heels. I pulled my hair back. I looked in the mirror, studying the calm, focused woman looking back at me. There was no hesitation in my eyes. The girl who used to cry over her mother's cruel comparisons was a distant memory. I was the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, ready to handle the situation with corporate precision. I walked down the hall to Leo's room. He was already awake, happily connecting colorful plastic train cars on his rug. I smiled, feeling a deep surge of protective warmth. My son was isolated from the toxic wreckage of my biological family. He did not know his grandparents were living in a cheap motel. He did not know his uncle was a criminal. He only knew he was loved, safe, and secure in his home. Lauren arrived right on time to take him to the local science museum for the day. I kissed Leo on the head, handed Lauren his packed lunch, and watched them pull out of the driveway. Once they were gone, the estate settled into a profound silence. I gathered my purse, picked up my keys, and walked out the front door. The drive to Chicago took 45 minutes. I navigated the morning traffic with effortless focus, my mind running through the upcoming sequence of events. The mediation was scheduled to take place at the prestigious offices of my legal team. It was a neutral, heavily controlled environment where emotional outbursts would be swiftly shut down by the presence of serious corporate attorneys. I pulled into the underground parking garage of the glass skyscraper. The private elevator whisked me up to the 42nd floor. The polished steel doors slid open to reveal a massive minimalist reception area featuring pristine white marble floors and sweeping views of the city skyline. The receptionist greeted me by name and directed me down the brightly lit hallway toward the primary executive conference room. David was waiting for me just outside the heavy frosted glass doors. He wore a sharp black suit and held a thick, dark red leather folder in his hands. The forensic audit. He gave me a brief, confident nod. "They are already inside," David said softly. Cameron brought his discount lawyer. Richard and Catherine insisted on being present as well. They are sitting at the table looking incredibly arrogant. Cameron is wearing a custom suit. He clearly thinks he is about to negotiate a massive payout. I looked at the heavy frosted glass doors, seeing the blurred shapes of my family members sitting on the other side. They had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them inside that red leather folder. They thought they were walking into a standard civil negotiation. They thought they could bully me one last time. "Let us not keep them waiting," I said, my voice perfectly steady. David reached out and pushed the heavy glass doors open. I stepped into the sunlit conference room. The long, polished mahogany table dominated the space. On the far side sat my father, my mother, and my brother, flanked by a nervous-looking attorney who clearly realized he was out of his depth in this corporate environment. Cameron leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest, a smug, victorious smirk playing across his lips. He believed he had the upper hand. I walked calmly to the opposite side of the table, pulled out my chair, and sat down to end his entire world. David took the seat to my right, placing the thick, dark red leather folder on the polished mahogany surface directly in front of him. He did not open it. He simply let it rest there, a silent promise of the devastation to come. On the other side of the table, Cameron's discount lawyer cleared his throat nervously. The man shifted in his seat, tugging at the collar of a suit that looked distinctly uncomfortable in this high-end corporate setting. He opened a thin manila file folder and attempted to project an air of confidence that completely failed to reach his eyes. My father, Richard, leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the table. He glared at me with a mixture of hostility and misplaced superiority. My mother, Catherine, sat rigidly beside him, her lips pursed into a thin white line of absolute disapproval. They were presenting a unified front, entirely convinced that they were about to witness my total financial surrender. Cameron did not even bother to sit up straight. He slouched in his expensive leather chair, tapping a gold pen against the table in a slow, rhythmic, and incredibly annoying pattern. He looked at me with a smirk so wide it bordered on a sneer. "Let us get straight to the point." Cameron's lawyer began, his voice wavering slightly before he forced it into a louder register. My client Cameron has suffered immense emotional distress and public humiliation due to the highly illegal and traumatic eviction executed by your client. Furthermore, we are asserting a valid claim of sweat equity. For the past 24 months, Cameron has acted as the primary property manager for the estate, overseeing maintenance, coordinating landscaping, and significantly improving the overall value of the asset. We estimate the value of these services combined with the damages for emotional distress to be no less than $5 million. If your client agrees to a swift and quiet settlement today, we are prepared to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and walk away. I did not flinch. I did not interrupt. I simply stared at Cameron, watching the sheer, unadulterated greed radiating from his face. He actually believed this was going to work. He thought throwing around legal buzzwords and threatening public exposure would force me to open my checkbook. He was so accustomed to manipulating our parents that he genuinely believed I was just as gullible. David let the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment. The ambient hum of his building's climate control system was the only sound in the room. Then David slowly folded his hands together and looked directly at the nervous attorney across the table. "Your demands are entirely without merit," David stated, his voice ringing with absolute corporate authority. "Your client signed a standard commercial lease agreement that explicitly prohibits any claims of sweat equity or property improvement compensation. The document is airtight. Furthermore, the eviction was executed flawlessly and entirely within the boundaries of local and state law, triggered by your client failing to pay rent for 14 consecutive months. We have already filed a motion to dismiss your frivolous lawsuit with prejudice. If you pursue this ridiculous claim any further, we will aggressively seek sanctions against you personally for filing a malicious action without a single shred of factual evidence." Cameron's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but his arrogance quickly overpowered his fleeting doubt. He leaned forward, dropping the gold pen onto the table with a sharp clatter. "You can throw around all the legal threats you want," Cameron spat, his voice laced with venom. "I know how this works, Valerie. You do not want a messy, dragged-out public court battle. You do not want the press digging into your little software company. Pay the $5 million, and I will graciously let you go back to your pathetic, lonely life in the guest house." My father nodded in vigorous agreement, turning his angry gaze toward me. "Listen to your brother, Valerie," Richard demanded harshly. "He is offering you a very generous way out of this nightmare you created. You humiliated this family in front of our friends. You threw your own parents into a disgusting roadside motel. You owe Cameron for the terrible damage you have done to his professional reputation. Pay him what he is asking for, and maybe we can finally put this disgraceful chapter behind us." I looked at my father, feeling a profound sense of pity for the deep, blinding ignorance he was currently displaying. He was fiercely defending the exact man who had secretly destroyed his entire future. I turned my head and looked at my mother. Catherine was staring at me with pure, undiluted hatred, completely ready to watch me lose millions of dollars just to see her golden child win. They were so tragically eager for my downfall. "I am not going to pay you a single dime, Cameron," I said, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through the tense atmosphere of the conference room. "But we are going to discuss your professional reputation." I reached out and placed my hand firmly on top of the dark red leather folder resting in front of David. I slowly slid the heavy folder across the smooth mahogany table. It glided silently, coming to a complete stop directly in front of my father. Richard looked down at the folder, his thick brow furrowing in confusion. He glanced back up at me, clearly not understanding what I had just handed him. "Open it," I commanded softly. Richard hesitated for a moment, casting a quick, uncertain glance at Cameron. Cameron frowned suddenly, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. The false confidence was beginning to crack. Richard reached out with thick fingers and flipped the heavy leather cover open. The very first page was a summary document printed on the official letterhead of an elite, globally recognized forensic accounting firm. My father began to read the text. The room fell so incredibly quiet that I could hear the faint, ragged sound of Cameron breathing. It took exactly 30 seconds for the devastating reality to hit my father. I watched the color completely drain from Richard's face. His skin turned a sickening ashen gray. His eyes widened to an unnatural degree, darting frantically back and forth across the crisp white paper, as if he were trying to force the numbers to change through sheer willpower. His hands began to shake violently, causing the pages of the report to rattle against the polished wood table. "Richard," my mother whispered, her voice trembling with sudden instinctive fear. She leaned closer to him, peering over his shoulder to look at the documents. "Richard, what is it? What does it say?" My father could not speak. He flipped to the second page, his movements growing increasingly desperate. He stared at the forged wire transfers that had completely bankrupted their retirement. He finally understood the absolute most devastating, horrible truth about his precious, beloved golden son. Richard dropped the thick stack of papers onto the polished mahogany table. The sharp slap of the heavy paper echoing in the silent conference room sounded like a gunshot. He stared at the forged wire transfer authorizations, his eyes wide and unblinking. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. He reached out a trembling hand and pointed a thick, shaking finger at the signature line on the top document. "That is not my signature," Richard whispered, his voice cracking into a high, fragile pitch that I had never heard before. He looked up at Cameron, his face twisted in a mask of absolute agony. "You forged my name. You stole my retirement fund. You took everything I worked my entire life to build." Catherine snatched the documents from the table. She pulled her reading glasses from her designer handbag with frantic, clumsy movements. She shoved the glasses onto her face and stared at the forensic accounting report. Her eyes darted rapidly across the columns of red numbers and the clear, undeniable proof of massive systematic theft. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a sickening shade of gray. She let out a low, guttural gasp that sounded like she was physically suffocating. "Cameron!" She choked out, her voice trembling violently. "Tell me this is a lie. Tell me this is some kind of terrible corporate mistake. Tell me you did not empty our accounts to pay for your leased cars." Cameron did not have a smug smirk on his face anymore. The arrogant, untouchable wealth manager was completely gone. He was backed into a corner with absolutely nowhere left to hide. The undeniable proof was sitting right in front of him, presented by an elite legal team in a high-rise corporate office. He could not charm his way out of this. He could not blame a banking glitch. He looked at the discount lawyer sitting beside him, silently pleading for a legal miracle. But the lawyer was already hastily packing his thin manila folder back into his cheap briefcase. The attorney wanted absolutely no part of a criminal wire fraud case. He stood up without saying a single word, refused to make eye contact with anyone at the table, and walked straight out of the conference room. He abandoned his client on the spot. The sound of the heavy glass door closing behind the retreating lawyer shattered the final illusion of control. Cameron realized he was entirely alone. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. He looked at our father, and instead of apologizing, he went on the defensive. He chose to attack the very people he had just robbed. "What did you expect me to do?" Cameron shouted, his voice cracking under the intense strain. "You expected perfection. You paraded me around your stupid country club and bragged about my massive wealth to all your rich friends. You demanded the lifestyle of a millionaire, and I was drowning trying to give it to you. The economy shifted, my investments tanked, I needed capital to keep my firm afloat, and you had all that money just sitting in stagnant retirement accounts doing absolutely nothing." Richard stared at his son in pure horror. Doing nothing, my father roared, slamming his fist down on the table so hard the water glasses rattled. That was our entire future. That was the money we needed to survive. We trusted you completely. We handed you our entire financial portfolio because you swore you were a genius. You took our money and you spent it on custom suits and fancy watches so you could pretend to be a king. You ruined us, Cameron. We are bankrupt. We have absolutely nothing left. Cameron stood up abruptly, knocking his expensive leather chair backward. It crashed onto the pristine white marble floor. I did it for you. Cameron screamed, his face red and slick with nervous sweat. I committed fraud so you could keep bragging to your superficial friends. I risked federal prison so you could sit on the patio of a $4 million estate and pretend you were royalty. You pushed me into this. You set an impossible standard and I broke the law to meet it. It is your fault. All of it is your fault. The sheer audacity of his blame shifting left my parents completely speechless. They sat frozen in their chairs, staring at the monster they had created and nurtured for 36 years. They had spent my entire life punishing me for my perceived failures, pouring all their love and resources into their golden child. Now that golden child was standing over them, screaming that they were the reason he had stolen their life savings. The poetic justice of the moment was profound, but I felt absolutely no joy in witnessing it. I just felt a deep, abiding disgust for the total moral bankruptcy of the people sitting across from me. Catherine slowly lowered the forensic documents onto the table. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely release the paper. She looked at Richard, seeing her own terror reflected in his eyes. They finally understood the grim reality of their situation. They were completely destitute. They had no home. They had no savings. Their country club friends had already blocked their phone numbers. The only person standing in the room who possessed the means to save them was the exact same daughter they had mercilessly abused and humiliated for decades. My mother slowly turned her head and looked directly at me. The arrogant, condescending matriarch was gone. In her place sat a terrified, broken woman who had just realized she was completely at the mercy of her favorite scapegoat. Her eyes filled with tears. Real, desperate, ugly tears spilled over her eyelashes and ran down her cheeks, ruining her carefully applied makeup. She reached her shaking hands across the wide mahogany table, palms turned upward in a pathetic gesture of submission. "Valerie, please!" Catherine wept, her voice breaking into a pathetic, ragged sob. "Please, you have to help us. We have absolutely nowhere to go. We are sleeping in a disgusting, filthy motel room. We do not have money for food. We do not have money for lawyers. Your brother has taken everything we spent our entire lives building. We are completely ruined. You are our daughter. You are a millionaire. You have that massive estate and guest house. Please just let us move back into the guest house." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the armrests of my chair. I watched her beg. I watched the woman who had loudly announced to her friends that I was a struggling failure, who refused to launch, now plead for my charity. "We will be completely quiet," my father chimed in, his voice stripped of all its former booming authority. He looked at me with wide, desperate eyes. "We will not bother you, Valerie. We will stay out of your way. We can help you maintain the property. We can do the landscaping. We can clean. Just please do not leave us out on the street. We are your parents. You cannot just abandon your own flesh and blood in a cheap motel. We need you." When appealing to my sense of familial duty did not immediately work, my mother shifted her tactics. She reached for the ultimate trump card, the exact manipulation tactic I knew she would eventually try to use against me. She brought up my son. "Think about Leo," Catherine pleaded, wiping the running mascara from her cheeks with the back of her trembling hand. "Leo loves us. He needs his grandparents in his life. You cannot take a boy away from his family. A child needs a village to raise him. We can be that village, Valerie. We can watch him while you work on your software business. We can be a real family again. We just made a terrible mistake trusting your brother. Please find it in your heart to forgive us for Leo's sake." I stared at her, feeling a cold, solid wall of absolute resolve settle firmly in my chest. The mere fact that she dared to use my sweet, innocent son as a bargaining chip to secure free housing filled me with a quiet, lethal anger. They did not care about Leo. They never cared about Leo. They only cared about their own comfort and survival. I slowly leaned forward, resting my forearms on the polished mahogany table. I looked directly into my mother's tear-filled eyes, making sure she saw the absolute finality in my gaze. "You do not get to use my son to save yourself," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. Every single word was a precisely calibrated strike. "You do not care about Leo. If you cared about Leo, you would not have sat at my dining table and allowed my father to scream in my face and call us freeloaders in front of him. You would not have smirked while my brother threatened to throw a 7-year-old boy out onto the street in the freezing cold. You do not want to be a grandmother. You just want a free roof over your head because your golden boy turned out to be a federal criminal." Catherine flinched violently, pulling her hands back across the table as if the wood had suddenly caught fire. "You called me a charity case," I continued, shifting my gaze to my father. "You told your wealthy friends that I was a pathetic disappointment who was draining your resources. Now you are sitting here begging to live in my guest house and offering to do my landscaping. The hypocrisy is absolutely staggering. You built your entire identity on the illusion of wealth and status. You chose the son who fed you those comfortable lies. You chose to tear me down simply because my authentic life did not match your country club aesthetic." "We were wrong," Richard pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "We see that now. We see the truth." "Seeing the truth when you have absolutely no other options is not a revelation, Richard. It is just basic survival," I replied coldly. "You do not respect me. You only respect my bank account. And I refuse to let my son grow up around people who measure human worth by the brand of their suit or the size of their estate. Family is not built on blood. Family is built on mutual respect, honesty, and unconditional support. You have never provided any of those things to me." I pushed my chair back and stood up. I buttoned my tailored charcoal blazer with calm, deliberate movements. "My legal team will be forwarding the full forensic audit to the federal authorities," I announced, glancing briefly at Cameron, who was now staring blankly at the floor, in total shock. "What you did with their retirement accounts is wire fraud. I highly suggest you find a very good criminal defense attorney. As for you two," I said, looking down at my parents one last time, "you are completely and permanently cut off. Do not call my phone. Do not show up at my property gates. Do not ever attempt to contact my son. If you violate these boundaries, my security team will have you arrested for trespassing and harassment." I turned to my corporate attorney. "Wrap this up, David. We are entirely finished here." I did not wait for a response. I did not look back at their weeping faces or listen to their final, pathetic apologies. I turned my back on the toxic wreckage of my biological family and walked straight out of the conference room. The heavy frosted glass doors closed firmly behind me, severing the connection forever. I walked down the brightly lit hallway toward the private elevator, my heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm on the pristine marble floor. I stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and felt a massive invisible weight completely vanish from my shoulders. I was finally truly free. 3 months later, the bitter chill of winter had melted away, replaced by the warm, vibrant air of an early spring evening. The massive $4 million estate was completely transformed. I had spent the last 90 days methodically erasing every single trace of my parents' superficial, pretentious country club aesthetic from the main house. The heavy, suffocating velvet drapes were gone, replaced by light, airy linen panels that let the sunshine pour into every room. The stiff, uncomfortable antique furniture had been donated, replaced by plush, welcoming modern seating designed for actual human comfort. The house no longer felt like a sterile museum, it felt like a real home. The vast set of French doors leading out to the stone patio were thrown wide open, letting a gentle, sweet-smelling breeze sweep through the main dining room. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table, but the atmosphere could not have been more different from that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. The table was covered in bright, cheerful wildflowers and mismatched, colorful ceramic plates. The air was filled with the rich, mouth-watering scent of a massive, home-cooked Italian feast that we had all spent the afternoon preparing together in the main kitchen. There were no arrogant wealth managers or judgmental suburban socialites in my home tonight. I was surrounded by genuine supportive friends who felt like true family. David, my brilliant corporate attorney, was sitting near the center of the table, laughing loudly at a joke being told by my incredible property manager. Lauren, my loyal nanny, was sitting next to them helping serve a massive bowl of roasted garlic pasta. My business partners from the software firm had flown in for the weekend, filling the room with loud, joyful conversation about our upcoming tech projects. I looked down toward the far end of the long dining table. Leo was sitting there, his face smeared with tomato sauce, giggling uncontrollably as David performed a ridiculous magic trick with a breadstick. My son was safe. He was completely surrounded by adults who valued kindness, honesty, and hard work. He would never have to endure the cruel comparisons or the toxic status chasing that had poisoned my own childhood. He was growing up in an environment built on absolute unconditional love. I picked up my glass of sparkling water and took a slow, refreshing sip. I looked out through the open French doors toward the shimmering surface of the private lake. The sunset was painting the sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold. I had recently read a brief news update online regarding my former family. Cameron was currently facing a lengthy federal indictment for his financial crimes. Richard and Catherine were renting a tiny, cramped apartment in a dreary industrial town miles away, completely alienated from everyone they used to know. They were entirely trapped in the miserable reality they had created for themselves. But that dark, toxic world had absolutely no bearing on my life anymore. I set my glass down on the table and smiled as Leo ran over to hug my waist, asking if it was time for dessert yet. I pulled my son close, breathing in the sweet scent of his shampoo. The toxic roots of my past had been completely and permanently severed. My foundation was solid, my boundaries were impenetrable, and my future was entirely my own. I looked around the warm, brightly lit dining room, listening to the beautiful sound of genuine laughter echoing off the walls, and knew with absolute certainty that I had finally built the perfect life. Have you ever had to sever ties with toxic relatives to protect your own peace? If this story resonated with you, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about setting boundaries and finding your true worth. Thank you for watching, and remember that you always have the power to write your own ending. Do you have any questions or want to discuss another type of situation? Looking back on the day I handed my family that eviction notice, I realized the most profound lesson was not about money or revenge. It was about recognizing the true definition of family. For years, I allowed my parents and my brother to treat me as less than simply because we shared the same bloodline. I bought into the toxic belief that family loyalty means enduring endless disrespect. What I learned from their betrayal is that true love and respect are not conditional based on your social status, your bank account, or the illusions you project to the world. My parents chose to worship a fabricated image of success, and in doing so, they completely blinded themselves to the reality of who was actually caring for them. When you constantly chase the approval of people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you only end up abandoning yourself. Walking away from my biological family was the hardest yet most liberating decision of my life. It taught me that boundaries are not just walls to keep toxic people out. They are the solid foundation upon which you build a healthy, authentic life. We do not owe our abusers a place in our future just because they share our past. Family is an action, a daily choice to show up with honesty, respect, and unconditional support. When you cut away the toxic roots, you finally give yourself the space to truly bloom. Have you ever found yourself trapped in a toxic family dynamic where you had to finally choose your own peace over their expectations? If you have had to make the difficult choice to walk away and build your own chosen family, I would love to hear your story in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about surviving betrayal, setting boundaries, and reclaiming your power. Remember, you hold the pen to your own life story.